Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that South Park's golden age did not end suddenly with a single bad season or a specific creative decision. Instead, it faded gradually as the show's satire, structure, and priorities shifted over many years. By examining how the show evolved from chaotic childhood adventures to message-driven commentary, how the kids stopped being the center of stories, how Randy Marsh became a main character, and how serialization changed the viewing experience, we can understand when and why South Park stopped feeling like the show that first shocked the world. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. What people mean by South Park's golden age. When fans talk about South Park's golden age, they are rarely talking about the same specific period of time. Some fans point to the very earliest seasons, when the show was pure shock value and cultural disruption. Others point to the middle seasons, when the satire became sharper and more sophisticated. Still others argue the show never had a golden age at all, and has been consistently good throughout its entire run. This lack of agreement makes discussing South Park's golden age complicated, because everyone brings different expectations and different memories to the conversation. Despite this disagreement about exact dates, most fans do agree on certain qualities that define what they remember as South Park at its best. These qualities form a kind of baseline expectation for what South Park should be, even if people disagree about when the show stopped meeting those expectations. Understanding what fans mean when they talk about the golden age requires looking at these shared expectations and understanding what made South Park feel special during whatever period each viewer considers the peak. The first quality most fans associate with South Park's golden age is irreverence and shock humor that felt genuinely transgressive. South Park became famous for being willing to say and show things that other television shows would never attempt. The show used profanity freely, at a time when animated shows rarely featured cursing. Characters said shocking things that violated social taboos about religion, sex, violence, and politics. Episodes dealt with controversial topics in blunt, offensive ways that generated outrage and headlines. This willingness to shock audiences felt revolutionary when the show premiered and remained a core part of its identity for many years. The shock value worked particularly well because it came from children's mouths rather than from adult characters. Having 8-year-old characters curse and discuss adult topics created a specific type of humor that felt transgressive in ways that adult animation like The Simpsons did not. Kids on television were supposed to be innocent and wholesome. South Park's kids were crude, violent, and said terrible things without remorse or growth. This violation of expectations was central to the show's appeal. The children were not cute, they were not learning valuable lessons. They were causing chaos and saying what adults would never say. Fans remember this shock humor as being purposeful rather than just random offensiveness. The show was not offensive simply to get attention. The offensive elements served the satire and the comedy. When Cartman said something racist, it revealed something about prejudice and how children absorb hateful attitudes from the world around them. When episodes showed graphic violence, it was commenting on desensitization to violence in media. The shock had a point beyond just being shocking, which separated South Park from shows that were merely crude. Another quality fans associate with the golden age is the episodic structure, where each episode stood alone as its own complete story. You could watch any episode without having seen previous episodes and still understand everything that was happening. The show reset at the end of each episode with characters forgetting what happened and relationships returning to their default state. Kenny would die in one episode and be alive again in the next, with no explanation needed. This episodic approach made the show accessible to casual viewers and allowed the show to tell wildly different types of stories from week to week without worrying about continuity. The episodic structure also created a specific pacing and rhythm that fans remember fondly. Episodes moved quickly through their plots without dwelling on emotional moments or building long-term storylines. The show prioritized comedy and satire over character development or narrative complexity. This fast-paced approach meant every episode felt packed with jokes and ideas, without wasting time on setup that would pay off in future episodes. Each episode was its own self-contained experience that delivered satisfaction within 22 minutes. This episodic approach had practical advantages for viewers. You could recommend a specific episode to someone without requiring them to watch 10 other episodes first. You could watch episodes in syndication on television without worrying about seeing them out of order. You could miss several weeks of the show and come back without feeling lost. This accessibility was part of what made South Park so popular and so easy to share with friends. Fans also remember the golden age as a time when satire was aimed broadly at institutions and hypocrisy, rather than at specific current events. audience. Early South Park made fun of categories of people and general social problems, rather than reacting to whatever was in the news that week. Episodes satirized topics like religion, commercialization, political correctness, and media manipulation. These were timeless targets that remained relevant regardless of what specific politicians were in office, or what specific scandals were happening. This broad satire gave episodes longevity. You could watch an episode years after it aired and still understand the jokes because they were about human nature and social patterns, rather than about specific news stories. The satire felt universal, rather than tied to particular moments in history. This timelessness is something many fans miss in later seasons, when the show became more focused on immediate reactions to current events. The broad approach to satire also meant the show could take on bigger ideas without being constrained by the specifics of real-world events. The show could explore concepts like censorship, authority, hypocrisy, and groupthink in ways that applied across many different situations. Episodes became commentaries on patterns of human behavior rather than responses to individual incidents. This gave the satire more weight and more staying power. The Golden Age is also remembered as a time when the show's perspective came primarily from the children. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny were the main characters whose adventures and conflicts drove most episodes. The kids would encounter some problem or get involved in some scheme, and the episode would follow their perspective as they navigated the situation. Adult characters existed mostly as obstacles or authority figures for the kids to deal with. The show felt like it was about childhood, even when it was dealing with very adult topics. This child-centered perspective created specific types of stories and specific types of humor. The kids' limited understanding of adult issues created comedy through their misinterpretations and their attempts to solve problems with childish logic. Episodes explored how kids see the world and how they process things they do not fully understand. The innocence of the children contrasted with the terrible things they said and did, which created a particular tone that felt unique to South Park. The child perspective also gave the show a particular emotional quality. We could laugh at the kids being crude and offensive, while also recognizing their vulnerability and their genuine feelings. Stan and Kyle's friendship felt real even when they were involved in absurd situations. The boys' reactions to scary or confusing situations reflected how children actually respond to the world. This grounding in childhood experience made the show relatable even when it was being outrageous. Fans remember the Golden Age as a time when episodes felt unpredictable. You never knew what direction an episode would take or how it would resolve its conflicts. The show was willing to do bizarre things and to commit to strange ideas fully. Episodes could suddenly shift tone or introduce completely unexpected elements. This unpredictability kept viewers engaged because they genuinely did not know what would happen next. The unpredictability extended to how episodes would end. South Park did not always wrap things up neatly or provide satisfying resolutions. Sometimes episodes would end abruptly or would resolve conflicts in unexpected ways. This refusal to follow conventional story structure made the show feel fresh and exciting. You could not predict where an episode was going based on formulas from other shows. The animation style during the Golden Age is also part of what fans remember. The crude cutout animation looked cheap and homemade, which added to the show's outsider appeal. South Park did not look like professional television animation. It looked like something made in someone's basement, which fit with the show's rebellious attitude. The simple animation also allowed the show to be produced quickly, which contributed to the topical nature of episodes even in early seasons. The crude animation became part of South Park's identity. The show proved that animation did not need to be polished or expensive to be successful. The simplicity of the animation forced viewers to focus on the writing and the ideas, rather than being distracted by visual spectacle. This fit with the show's anti-establishment attitude. South Park was succeeding despite not following the rules about what television animation should look like. Many fans also associate the Golden Age with a specific cultural moment, when South Park felt dangerous and subversive. The show generated genuine controversy and moral panic. Parents' groups protested it, politicians condemned it, school districts banned students from wearing South Park merchandise. The show's very existence felt like a challenge to cultural norms about what television could show and say. This sense of cultural disruption was part of the viewing experience. Watching South Park felt like participating in something transgressive that adults did not want you to see. This cultural controversy made South Park feel important beyond just being funny. The show was challenging power and questioning authority in ways that felt meaningful. The outrage from authority figures validated the show's rebellious message. When parents and politicians condemned South Park, it proved the show was doing something that threatened the status quo. This gave viewers a sense of participating in cultural rebellion by watching and enjoying the show. The Golden Age is remembered as a time when the show had clear targets for its satire and clear positions it was arguing for, even if those positions were often just anti-authority or anti-hypocrisy. The show stood for questioning everything and refusing to accept what you were told by people in power. This rebellious stance felt meaningful during the show's early years, when it seemed like the show actually believed in something beyond just making jokes. Different fans place different weights on these various qualities when defining the Golden Age. Some fans care most about the shock value and the crude humor. Others care most about the satirical intelligence and the willingness to tackle controversial topics. Still others care most about the episodic structure and the child-centered perspective. These different priorities explain why fans disagree about when the Golden Age ended. They are measuring against different standards. What unites most discussions of the Golden Age is a sense that South Park used to feel different in some fundamental way. The show felt fresher, more exciting, more unpredictable, and more culturally relevant than it does now. Whether this perception reflects real changes in the show or changes in how viewers relate to the show is part of what makes the question of when the Golden Age ended so difficult to answer. Memory and nostalgia shape how we remember television shows, especially shows we watched when we were younger. The concept of a golden age also assumes that shows have peaks and declines, rather than simply evolving into different forms. This assumption might not be entirely fair. South Park has changed dramatically over its long run, yet change does not necessarily mean decline. Some of the qualities fans miss from the Golden Age might have been limitations that the show outgrew rather than strengths that the show abandoned. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The qualities fans associate with South Park's Golden Age were established during the show's earliest seasons, when South Park first disrupted television and became a cultural phenomenon. Section 2. The Early Seasons and Cultural Disruption. South Park premiered on Comedy Central in August 1997 with an episode called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. This first episode established immediately that South Park was going to be different from any animated show that had come before. The episode featured crude construction paper animation, excessive profanity, toilet humor, graphic violence, and a plot involving alien abduction and anal probing. It was shocking, disgusting, and unlike anything on television at the time. The premiere episode ended with a musical number featuring characters dancing and singing about the anal probing incident, which perfectly captured the show's willingness to be offensive in ways that other shows would never attempt. Comedy Central received complaints and controversy almost immediately after the premiere aired on August 13, 1997, which only generated more publicity and more viewers curious to see what all the outrage was about. The show's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, were young men in their late 20s with very little experience in professional television production when they created South Park. They had created a crude animated short film called The Spirit of Christmas in 1995 that featured characters who would become the South Park Kids. The short was made using construction paper cutouts and showed the characters getting into a violent fight between Jesus and Santa Claus. The short was offensive and funny in ways that suggested these creators did not care about following television conventions or pleasing everyone who watched. The short circulated in Hollywood and caught the attention of Comedy Central executives who saw potential in the characters and the style. When Comedy Central gave them the opportunity to make a full series, Parker and Stone maintained that outsider mentality and that willingness to offend anyone and everyone. The first season of South Park consisted of 13 episodes that aired from August 1997 to February 1998. These early episodes established the core cast of characters and the basic premise of the show. Stan Marsh was the relatively normal kid who often served as the audience's point of view character. He was grounded and reasonable compared to the other kids. Kyle Broflovsky was Stan's best friend, a Jewish kid who dealt with being different in a mostly Christian town, and who often served as the moral center when the show had one. Eric Cartman was the fat, racist, selfish kid who said the most offensive things and who represented the worst impulses of childhood without any filter. Kenny McCormick was the poor kid who wore an orange parka that muffled his voice and who died in nearly every episode in increasingly absurd ways. These four kids lived in the small mountain town of South Park, Colorado, where bizarre and terrible things happened regularly, despite the town appearing normal on the surface. The first season episodes were simple in structure and relied heavily on shock value for their comedy. Episode plots would involve things like a volcano threatening to destroy the town while the kids were on a hunting trip, genetic engineering experiments creating mutant turkeys for Thanksgiving, or Cartman's mother being revealed as a hermaphrodite, in a cliffhanger that would not be resolved until the next season. The humor came from how crude and offensive everything was, without apology. Characters said things that violated every rule of political correctness that had developed in American culture during the 1990s. The animation showed things that seemed designed purely to disgust viewers and to push the boundaries of what cable television would allow. The show felt like it existed specifically to push boundaries and to see what it could get away with. What made these early episodes work beyond just shock value was the sharp writing underneath the crudeness. Parker and Stone were good writers who understood comedy structure and satire, even when being intentionally offensive. The jokes were actually funny, rather than just shocking for the sake of shock. The dialogue was clever and quotable in ways that made phrases from the show enter popular culture. The plots, while bizarre, followed logical progression and made sense within their own absurd internal logic. The show was well made despite looking and sounding like something thrown together quickly. The cultural reaction to South Park's first season was intense and widespread. Parents groups condemned the show as corrupting children, despite it airing late at night and being clearly intended for adults. Politicians criticized it in speeches and interviews as representing a decline in American values. Media outlets wrote articles debating whether the show had gone too far, and whether Comedy Central should be allowed to air such offensive content. Some critics praised it as brilliant satire that exposed American hypocrisy, while others dismissed it as juvenile garbage that appealed to the lowest common denominator. The controversy generated enormous publicity that drove more people to watch the show. South Park became a cultural phenomenon almost immediately, unlike most shows that build audiences gradually. Season 2, which aired from 1998 to 1999, expanded on what the first season established, while refining the show's approach. The animation improved incrementally, while maintaining the crude cutout style that had become part of the show's identity. The writing became sharper, and the satire became more focused on specific targets rather than just being generally offensive. Episodes like Gnomes satirized corporate culture and capitalism through a story about underwear-stealing gnomes who had a three-phase business plan that did not make sense. The gnomes would steal underwear, then had a question mark for Phase 2, then profit for Phase 3. This became a famous meme about how corporations often have vague plans. The episode showed that South Park could make intelligent points about economics while still being absurd. Chef Aid brought in multiple celebrity guest stars for a benefit concert storyline that helped the character Chef fight a lawsuit. The episode featured voices from musicians like Ozzy Osbourne, Elton John, and others, which showed that celebrities were willing to participate in South Park despite its controversial reputation. Chickenpox dealt with parents trying to get their kids sick intentionally to build immunity to the disease, which satirized parenting trends and health fads that prioritized unconventional approaches over common sense. The show maintained its shock value while demonstrating it could do more than just offend people. The satire had teeth and actual points to make about society and human behavior. The show was proving that crude humor and intelligent commentary could coexist in the same episode, without one undermining the other. This combination of lowbrow and highbrow elements became part of what made South Park distinctive, and what separated it from shows that were merely crude. One significant development in Season 2 was that Kenny's deaths became a formalized running joke that viewers anticipated. The first season had killed Kenny frequently, yet Season 2 made it a consistent element that happened almost every episode. Every episode found a new way to kill Kenny, often in absurd or graphic ways that were creative in their violence. Stan would say, "Oh my god, they killed Kenny!" And Kyle would respond, "You bastards!" This exchange became one of the most recognizable elements of South Park and entered popular culture. The running gag showed how the show could turn something dark, like child death, into comedy through repetition and creativity. The deaths were funny because they were over the top and acknowledged their own absurdity. Season 3, airing in 1999 and 2000, showed the show becoming more confident and ambitious in its scope. Episodes became more complex in their satire and more willing to take on controversial topics directly. Rainforest Schmainforest satirized environmental activism and celebrity causes by sending the kids on a field trip with an annoying activist named Miss Stevens who wanted to save the rainforest. The episode made fun of how celebrity activism often feels more about making celebrities feel good than about actually helping. Sexual Harassment Panda dealt with lawsuit culture and how sensitivity training could go too far. The episode featured a character dressed as a panda who taught about sexual harassment through songs and performances. The episode satirized how American culture had become obsessed with lawsuits. Shin Pokemon satirized Pokemon and Japanese culture while commenting on American consumerism and how marketing manipulated children. The episode showed kids becoming obsessed with a Japanese toy line in ways that parodied the real Pokemon craze. The show was finding its voice as social satire that had specific points to make while maintaining the crude humor. The satire became more sophisticated, while the shock value remained constant. Episodes could make intelligent arguments about social issues while still featuring characters saying offensive things. This balance became South Park's formula for success. The theatrical movie South Park: Bigger, Longer, and Uncut came out in 1999 during Season 3. The movie demonstrated that South Park could work as a feature film while showing how much ambition Parker and Stone had. The movie was a full musical, with songs throughout that parodied Disney animated musicals while being as offensive as possible. The plot dealt with censorship and moral panic by being intentionally offensive. The kids sneak into an R-rated movie featuring their favorite Canadian comedians, Terrence and Phillip, learn curse words, and repeat them constantly. This leads to a moral panic among parents who blame Canada for corrupting American children. The movie escalates into a war between the United States and Canada. The movie received critical acclaim from reviewers who recognized the intelligence behind the crude humor. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song for Blame Canada, which gave South Park mainstream recognition. The nominations showed that the entertainment industry was taking South Park seriously as creative work. The movie showed that beneath the crudeness was genuine talent in writing, music, and animation. Parker and Stone were skilled filmmakers who used shock value as a tool for satire. The movie made over $60 million at the box office, which was significant for an R-rated animated film. Season 4, airing in 2000 and 2001, continued the trend of the show becoming smarter while staying shocking. The Tooth Fairy's Tats 2000 parodied mob movies through a story about kids running a tooth fairy racket. The episode used mafia movie tropes to tell a story about children, which created humor through contrast. Quintuplets 2000 satirized exploitation of children and media spectacles by showing how everyone wanted to profit from Romanian quintuplets. Helen Keller, the musical, dealt with disability and Thanksgiving by featuring the kids putting on a school play about Helen Keller, with a turkey playing the lead role. The episode was absurd while satirizing how schools teach history. The show was tackling bigger targets and doing more sophisticated satire while never losing the crude humor. Episodes could reference high culture and low culture in the same breath. The show could make jokes requiring knowledge of film history while also making fart jokes. This range allowed South Park to appeal to different viewers simultaneously. These first 4 seasons from 1997 to 2000 are what many fans think of when they remember South Park at its purest. The show was driven primarily by what the kids were doing. The satire targeted broad social issues rather than specific current events. Episodes stood alone, without requiring viewers to know what happened previously. The show felt unpredictable and dangerous. Every episode seemed designed to push boundaries. The cultural impact during these early seasons was enormous. South Park merchandise became hugely popular despite the show's adult content and many retailers refusing to sell it. Kids wore Cartman t-shirts and repeated catchphrases in everyday conversation. The show influenced how people talked and what they found funny. It made crude humor and offensive jokes more socially acceptable by bringing them into mainstream comedy. South Park also influenced other creators and other shows. The success helped prove there was an audience for adult animation beyond The Simpsons. It showed that controversial content could be commercially successful and critically respected. It demonstrated that cheap animation did not prevent a show from being popular if the writing was good enough. South Park opened doors for other adult animated shows to exist. The early seasons established South Park as a show that spoke to young people who felt alienated from mainstream culture. The show's rebellious attitude and refusal to respect authority appealed to viewers who felt like outsiders. South Park said the things you thought but were not supposed to say. It acknowledged that the world was absurd and hypocritical. This resonated with viewers tired of being told what to think. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The early seasons built South Park's reputation as crude and shocking. Yet around Season 5, something started to shift as the show began getting noticeably smarter in how it approached satire. Section 3. When the show started getting smarter. Around Season 5, which began airing in 2001, something started to change about South Park in ways that some fans noticed immediately, while others only recognized in retrospect. The show was still crude and offensive and willing to push boundaries, yet the satire became sharper and more focused. The episode started telling more complex stories with more deliberate structure. The humor was still shocking, yet it felt more purposeful and less random than it had been in earlier seasons. This period, which ran roughly from seasons 5 through 7, is what many fans consider to be peak South Park, the moment when the show fully realized its potential as intelligent satire disguised as crude comedy. The shift did not happen all at once, with a single episode or a clear announcement from the creators. It was gradual enough that casual viewers might not have noticed anything different at first. The show still looked the same, with its crude cutout animation. The characters still sounded the same, with the same voice actors. The basic premise remained unchanged, with 4 kids getting into absurd situations in their small Colorado town. Yet something fundamental had changed about how the show approached storytelling and satire. One of the clearest examples of this shift is the episode Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5, which aired in July 2001. This episode is often cited by fans and critics as one of the greatest South Park episodes ever made, and as a turning point for the series. The episode tells a relatively simple story on the surface. An 8th grader named Scott Tenorman sells his pubic hair to Cartman for $10 as a prank. Cartman realizes he has been tricked and becomes obsessed with getting revenge on Scott Tenorman for making him look stupid. What makes this episode significant is how dark and elaborate Cartman's revenge becomes. Throughout the episode, Cartman tries various schemes to get back at Scott, all of which fail spectacularly. Scott outsmarts Cartman at every turn, making Cartman look more and more foolish. The episode builds tension as Cartman becomes increasingly desperate and angry. Then, in the final act, Cartman reveals his ultimate plan. He has orchestrated an elaborate scheme where Scott's parents are killed and ground into chili, which Scott then eats unknowingly at a chili cook-off that Cartman has organized. This ending was darker than anything South Park had done before. Previous episodes had featured death and violence, yet they were always cartoonish and clearly not meant to be taken seriously. Kenny's deaths were absurd and played for laughs. This episode presented Cartman doing something genuinely evil and horrifying. The episode showed Cartman as a sociopath, capable of planning and executing a revenge plot that involved murdering 2 people and feeding them to their son. The episode did not soften this, or make it silly. It played the horror of what Cartman did relatively straight. The episode also featured a guest appearance by the band Radiohead, which added another layer to Cartman's revenge. Scott Tenorman was a huge Radiohead fan, and part of Cartman's plan involved making Radiohead witness Scott's breakdown when he discovered what he had eaten. The band members appeared in the episode and were horrified by what they saw, calling Scott a crybaby before leaving. This added humiliation to the horror of what Cartman had done. Scott Tenorman Must Die showed that South Park could tell stories with real stakes and real consequences, at least within the context of an episode. It showed that the show could build tension and create genuine emotional responses beyond just laughter. It demonstrated that Cartman could be more than just a racist kid who said offensive things. He could be a genuinely frightening character, capable of terrible acts. This depth of characterization was new for the show. The episode also showed more sophisticated narrative structure than earlier episodes. The entire episode built toward the reveal of Cartman's plan, with clues planted throughout that viewers could piece together on rewatching. The episode rewarded attention and thought in ways that random, cutaway-based comedy did not. This marked a shift toward more deliberate storytelling, where everything in an episode connected to a central idea or plot. Season 5 included other episodes that showed this increasing sophistication. Proper condom use dealt with sex education in schools by showing the school teaching kindergarteners about sex in graphic ways, while older students received inadequate education. The episode satirized how schools often get sex education wrong in both directions, being too explicit for young children, while being too vague for teenagers who actually need information. Cartmanland explored themes of fairness and justice through a story about Cartman inheriting money and buying an amusement park just for himself. The episode examined why bad things happen to good people by showing Kyle getting sick while Cartman got everything he wanted. These episodes showed that South Park was becoming more interested in exploring ideas and themes, rather than just making jokes. The crude humor was still present, yet it served larger purposes. The shock value was still there, yet it had meaning beyond just being shocking. The show was maturing while maintaining its identity. Season 6, which aired from 2002 to 2003, continued this trend of smarter, more focused satire. Episodes became even more deliberate in their targets and their messages. The Death Camp of Tolerance satirized tolerance education by showing Mr. Garrison doing increasingly inappropriate things in his classroom to try to get fired for being gay. When the school refuses to fire him out of fear of appearing intolerant, the students are sent to a tolerance camp for complaining about his behavior. The episode made a point about how tolerance can be taken to absurd extremes, where actual inappropriate behavior is ignored. Red Hot Catholic Love dealt with the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal by having the boys trying to get their parents to stop attending a Catholic church where priests were molesting children. The episode was shocking in its directness about the scandal, yet it also made serious points about institutional corruption and how organizations protect themselves rather than victims. The episode did not just make jokes about priests abusing children. It examined why such abuse could continue, and why people stayed loyal to institutions that failed them. The return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers showed the boys on a quest to return a pornographic videotape that was accidentally given to them instead of the Lord of the Rings movie their parents intended. The episode parodied Lord of the Rings while also commenting on how children are exposed to adult content and how parents try to control what their kids see. The episode was funny and creative while also being about something beyond just the immediate plot. Season 6 also included Free Hat, which satirized how films get altered and re-released with changes that directors claim improve them. The episode made fun of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg for making changes to their classic films. The episode showed the boys trying to prevent the re-release of altered versions of Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. The episode was timely, referencing real debates happening in film culture, while also being accessible to viewers who did not follow those debates closely. Season 7, airing from 2003 to 2004, represents perhaps the peak of this smarter era of South Park. The episodes from this season are frequently cited as among the best the show ever produced. Cancelled brought back the alien visitors from the first episode and revealed that Earth was actually a reality show being watched by aliens. The episode played with the show's own mythology while making points about reality television and voyeurism. Christian Rock Hard had Cartman starting a Christian rock band to win a bet with Kyle about who could get a platinum record first. The episode satirized Christian rock music while also examining how commercial Christianity had become. The episode showed Cartman succeeding by simply taking regular love songs and replacing Baby with Jesus, which made a point about how shallow much Christian rock music was. The episode was funny while also being genuinely critical of how religion was commercialized. All About Mormons told the story of a Mormon family moving to South Park and the boys learning about Mormon beliefs. The episode presented Mormon doctrine honestly, showing the story of Joseph Smith and the Golden Plates. The episode made fun of how absurd the story seemed, while also showing the Mormon family as genuinely nice people who lived better lives because of their faith. The episode ended with a speech from the Mormon kid telling Stan that it did not matter if the story was true, because it made his family happy and good. This was sophisticated commentary on religion that acknowledged both the absurdity of religious claims and the genuine value religion provided to believers. Raisins was a surprisingly emotional episode about Stan dealing with heartbreak when his girlfriend Wendy breaks up with him. The episode showed Stan going through genuine depression, while Butters dealt with his own heartbreak in a healthier way. The episode was funny, yet also emotionally resonant in ways that earlier South Park episodes rarely attempted. The episode showed that the show could make viewers feel things beyond just laughter. These seasons from 5 through 7 showed South Park becoming more ambitious in its storytelling and more sophisticated in its satire. The episodes still featured the crude humor and shock value that had always defined the show, yet these elements now served larger purposes. The show was not just trying to offend people or push boundaries for the sake of it. The offensiveness and the boundary pushing were tools the show used to make points about society and human behavior. The writing during this period became more layered and more rewarding on repeated viewing. Episodes would include jokes and references that worked on multiple levels. Casual viewers could laugh at the surface humor, while more attentive viewers could appreciate the deeper satire and commentary. The show was respecting its audience's intelligence while still being accessible and entertaining. The narrative structure also became more sophisticated during these seasons. Episodes would build toward climaxes and revelations. Stories would have actual arcs, where characters wanted things and faced obstacles, and either succeeded or failed in meaningful ways. The episodic reset button was still there, with characters returning to their default states at the start of each episode. Yet within individual episodes, there was real story development and progression. The characterization deepened as well during this period. Cartman became more than just a fat, racist kid. He became a complex villain capable of elaborate schemes and genuine evil. Stan became more than just the normal kid.
He became someone capable of real emotions and growth, at least within individual episodes.
Kyle became more than just the moral center. He became someone whose principles could be tested and challenged. Even Kenny, who spent most episodes dead, got more development during this period, with episodes exploring his poverty and his family life. The satire during these seasons also became more focused and more effective. Earlier, South Park had satirized everything broadly, without necessarily having specific targets or specific points to make. These seasons showed the creators had things they wanted to say about specific aspects of American culture. The show tackled religion, politics, commercialism, media, education, and social trends with more precision and more purpose than before. Many fans consider these seasons to represent South Park at its absolute best. The show had refined its approach and figured out how to be shocking and smart simultaneously. The crude animation and offensive humor were still present, yet they were in service of intelligent commentary. The show proved that you could make a cartoon about 8-year-olds saying terrible things and also make serious points about society. The success of this period showed that audiences were hungry for comedy that challenged them and made them think. South Park was not just making people laugh, it was making people talk about the issues the show raised. Episodes would generate discussions and debates about the topics they covered. The show had become culturally relevant in a way that went beyond just being controversial. This period also showed that Parker and Stone had grown as writers and as satirists. They were more skilled at constructing narratives and more thoughtful about what they wanted to say. The show felt more confident and more assured. The creators knew what they were doing and knew how to do it well. This confidence showed in the quality of the episodes. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The smarter satire and more sophisticated storytelling of seasons 5 through 7 represented South Park reaching its creative peak. Yet this very sophistication would soon lead the show in directions that would change its fundamental structure. Section 4. The beginning of structural change. After reaching what many fans considered a creative peak during seasons 5 through 7, South Park began to change in ways that were subtle at first, yet would eventually transform how the show worked. These changes began appearing around season 8, which aired in 2004, and became more pronounced in seasons 9 and 10. The show was still funny and still capable of producing excellent episodes. Yet something was shifting in how episodes were constructed and what the show prioritized. The satire was becoming more message-driven and more focused on specific current events rather than timeless patterns of human behavior. One of the first signs of this structural change was that episodes started feeling more like arguments the creators wanted to make, rather than stories they wanted to tell. Earlier, South Park would present situations and let the humor and satire emerge naturally from those situations. The episodes from this transitional period often felt like they began with a point Parker and Stone wanted to make, and then the episode was constructed to make that point as clearly as possible. The comedy served the message, rather than the message emerging from the comedy. This might sound like a subtle distinction, yet it fundamentally changed how episodes felt to watch. This shift can be seen in episodes like Goobacks from season 8, which dealt with immigration. The episode showed people from the future traveling back in time to find work in the present because the future was economically devastated. These time travelers spoke in garbled language that mixed words together, and they were willing to work for very low wages because any money was better than what they had in their own time. This made present-day workers angry because they were losing their jobs to people who would accept less pay. The townspeople held meetings to discuss what to do about this problem, and came up with increasingly absurd solutions, including one proposal to make everyone in town gay so that future humans would never be born in the first place. The episode was clearly about contemporary immigration debates, with the time travelers standing in for immigrants from poor countries who came to America seeking better economic opportunities. The episode made its point about immigration clearly and directly. It showed that the time travelers were people trying to survive and support their families, not villains trying to steal jobs. It also showed that their presence created real problems for workers who were already struggling economically. The episode tried to be balanced by showing multiple perspectives on a complicated issue, yet the structure of the episode was built around delivering that message rather than around telling a funny story that happened to touch on immigration. The immigration debate was the point of the episode, and the time travel premise was just a vehicle for making points about that debate. Douche and Turd from season 8 showed another aspect of this change in how the show approached topics. The episode dealt with voting and political choice by having the school vote on a new mascot to replace their current one. The choices were a giant douche, or a turd sandwich, which was the show's blunt way of saying that political choices often come down to picking the lesser of two evils, rather than selecting a candidate you genuinely support. Stan refused to vote because both options were terrible, and he could not, in good conscience, support either one. The town reacted with outrage at Stan's refusal to participate, eventually exiling him from South Park entirely. Diddy appeared in the episode to threaten Stan about not voting, which was a reference to the real P. Diddy's Vote or Die campaign from that election year. This episode showed how the show was becoming more interested in making specific political points than in telling stories about kids in a small town. The episode was really about the 2004 presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry, with the show arguing that both candidates were deeply flawed, yet people still needed to participate in democracy. The episode's story about a school mascot election was just a thin framework for making this argument about real-world politics. The message about civic responsibility was clear and direct. Best Friends Forever from Season 9 dealt with the Terry Schiavo case, which was a huge news story in early 2005 about a brain-damaged woman whose husband wanted to remove her feeding tube while her parents fought in court to keep her alive. The case became a massive political controversy involving Congress and the president. The episode had Kenny getting hit by a truck while playing with his new PlayStation Portable, which left him in a persistent vegetative state in the hospital. Cartman fought desperately to keep Kenny alive, going to court and arguing passionately for Kenny's right to life. The twist was that Cartman only wanted Kenny alive because heaven needed Kenny to lead their army against Satan in an upcoming war. Meanwhile, Kyle argued that Kenny should be allowed to die with dignity because that was what Kenny himself would have wanted. The episode made points about right-to-die issues and about how politics and religion influenced end-of-life decisions that should be private family matters. The episode satirized how politicians use the Schiavo case for political gain, and how religious organizations pushed their agenda without considering what the person involved might have actually wanted. The episode was clever and funny and well-constructed, winning an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. Yet it was fundamentally a response to a specific news story from March 2005, rather than a timeless exploration of death and family. The episode required viewers to know about the Terry Schiavo case to fully understand what was being satirized. Viewers watching the episode years later would need to research what was happening in 2005 to get all the references. This was a significant change from earlier South Park, which satirized patterns rather than events. This shift toward topical satire meant that episodes were becoming more tied to specific moments in time rather than being timeless. Earlier South Park episodes could be watched decades later and still make complete sense because they were about general ideas and universal human experiences. An episode about commercialism ruining Christmas would always be relevant because commercialism always affects holidays. An episode responding to a specific news story from 2005 would feel dated as soon as that news story was forgotten by the general public. The show was also requiring more cultural awareness and knowledge from viewers during this period. Earlier episodes could be enjoyed by anyone who understood basic American culture. These newer episodes often required viewers to follow the news closely and to know about specific controversies and specific public figures. This made the show less accessible to casual viewers or to international audiences who might not follow American news as closely. Trapped in the Closet from Season 9 showed both the strengths and the problems of this new approach. The episode dealt with Scientology and directly satirized Tom Cruise and other celebrity Scientologists. Stan took a personality test at the local Scientology center and was identified as the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. The episode explained Scientology's beliefs by showing them on screen while text appeared saying, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The episode detailed the story of Xenu and the space aliens killed in volcanoes. Tom Cruise literally hid in Stan's closet and refused to come out when asked. John Travolta and R. Kelly joined him in the closet. The episode was brave for taking on a controversial religious organization known for aggressively suing critics. The episode was funny and effective satire, yet it was also completely focused on a specific target in a specific cultural moment. The episode was about Tom Cruise and Scientology in 2005, not about broader patterns of celebrity or religion. The episode generated huge controversy. Isaac Hayes, who had voiced Chef since the beginning, quit South Park over this episode because he was a Scientologist. Comedy Central pulled the episode from reruns for a period. The episode showed the power of this targeted approach, and showed South Park could still generate genuine controversy with real consequences. Yet it also showed how the show was moving away from timeless satire toward immediate reactions to current events. The humor during this transitional period also started requiring more knowledge of current events and pop culture to fully appreciate.
Earlier, South Park would make references to movies and celebrities, yet the core humor worked even if you did not get all the references. These newer episodes often had humor that only worked if you knew what was being referenced. The jokes were less self-contained and more dependent on outside knowledge. Episodes also started feeling less random and chaotic during this period, which sounds like it would be a good thing, yet many fans felt it made the show less fun. Earlier, South Park would go in unexpected directions and would include absurd elements that had nothing to do with the main plot. The unpredictability was part of the appeal. These newer episodes were more focused and more structured, which made them feel more controlled and less spontaneous. Everything in an episode connected to the central theme or argument the creators wanted to make. The show's relationship with controversy was also changing in noticeable ways. Earlier, South Park generated controversy somewhat accidentally by being shocking and offensive without necessarily planning for specific reactions. During this transitional period, the show started courting controversy more deliberately. Episodes seemed designed to generate specific reactions and to create specific debates. The controversy became more calculated. This calculated approach to controversy could be seen in how the show handled religion during this period. The show did not just make jokes about religious beliefs. It directly challenged religious organizations and religious leaders in ways designed to generate maximum outrage. The Scientology episode was the clearest example, yet other episodes during this time also seemed designed to provoke specific religious groups. The Muhammad cartoon controversy episodes from Season 10 showed this approach at its most extreme. The show created a storyline about Family Guy planning to show an image of the Prophet Muhammad, which was controversial because Islam prohibits depicting Muhammad. South Park itself then showed Muhammad in their episode, which generated enormous controversy and threats of violence. Comedy Central ended up censoring the image in later broadcasts, which became part of the story the show was telling about censorship and fear. These episodes were clearly making a point about free speech and about how fear of violent reactions was causing self-censorship. The episodes were brave in their willingness to challenge threats and to defend the principle of free expression. Yet they were also examples of how the show was becoming more interested in making statements and generating reactions than in simply being funny. The Muhammad storyline was designed to create controversy and to force discussions about censorship. The pacing of episodes was also changing during this period. Earlier episodes moved quickly and were packed with jokes. These newer episodes often felt slower because they were building arguments and developing ideas. The episode would take time to explain what it was satirizing and to show different perspectives on an issue. This made for more thoughtful satire, yet less joke density per minute. The characters themselves were also changing in how they functioned within episodes. Stan and Kyle were increasingly becoming mouthpieces for the creators' views rather than being characters with their own perspectives. When Stan or Kyle would give a speech at the end of an episode explaining the moral or the point, it was clearly Parker and Stone speaking directly to the audience. The characters were becoming transparent vessels for the creators' messages. Cartman remained more of an actual character during this period, because his awfulness allowed for more dramatic range. Cartman could be the antagonist who represented bad ideas and bad behavior. Yet even Cartman was sometimes used as a tool for making points rather than being an interesting character in his own right. The adult characters were also starting to become more prominent during this transitional period. Episodes would spend more time on what the adults in South Park were doing and thinking. Randy Marsh, Stan's father, was getting more screen time and more storylines centered on him. This shift toward adult perspectives was another sign that the show was moving away from its child-centered approach. This period from seasons 8 through 10 represented South Park in transition. The show was still capable of brilliant satire and genuinely funny episodes. Many episodes from these seasons are considered classics by fans. Yet the foundation of what the show was and how it worked was shifting in ways that would become more pronounced in later seasons. The show was becoming more topical, more message-driven, more dependent on current events, and less focused on the kids. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The structural changes that began appearing in seasons 8 through 10 would accelerate in the years to come, particularly in how the show treated its main characters and whose perspective drove the episodes. Section 5. When the kids stopped being the center. One of the most important changes that happened to South Park over the course of its run was how the kids gradually stopped being the main characters in any meaningful way. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny had always been the heart of the show. They were the ones having adventures, getting into trouble, and reacting to the absurd world around them. The show was called South Park, and it was about these 4 kids living in that town. Yet somewhere along the way, the
the kids stopped driving the stories and started just reacting to what adults were doing.
They stopped being active participants in their own show and became passive observers, commenting on events they had no control over. In the early seasons of South Park, the kids were always the ones making things happen. They would get an idea, pursue it, and create chaos through their actions. Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, from the very first episode, had Cartman dealing with aliens while his friends tried to figure out what was happening. The kids were the ones investigating, the ones making decisions, the ones taking action. Cartman's Mom Is a Dirty Slut had Cartman trying to figure out who his father was by going around town and asking questions. The entire episode was driven by what Cartman wanted to know and what he did to find out. Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo, from Season 1, had Kyle trying to convince everyone that Mr. Hanky was real. He went through the episode actively pursuing this goal, talking to people, getting in trouble, and dealing with the consequences of his actions. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny were not sitting around watching things happen. They were the ones causing things to happen. The adults in these early episodes existed to create obstacles for the kids or to be the targets of the kids' schemes. The show was about childhood and about how kids see the world and try to navigate it. Even when the show dealt with adult topics or satirized current events, it did so through the kids' perspective. Rainforest Schmainforest, from Season 3, had the boys forced to go on a school trip to the rainforest. They hated every minute of it and just wanted to go home. The episode satirized environmental activism and people who romanticize nature, yet it did so by showing how the kids experienced this trip. The kids were not making speeches about environmentalism, they were just trying to survive and get back home. The satire came from what happened to them and how they reacted to it. Chinpokomon, from Season 3, satirized how American culture gets obsessed with Japanese trends. The kids got really into a Pokemon-style toy craze that was actually a Japanese plot to turn American children against their parents. The episode worked because we watched the kids get swept up in this craze and saw how it affected their behavior. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny were the main characters experiencing the story. The adults appeared to react to what the kids were doing. This pattern continued through the early seasons and into what many fans consider the golden age. Scott Tenorman Must Die, from Season 5, was entirely about Cartman's plan to get revenge on an older kid who had tricked him. Cartman spent the whole episode plotting, scheming, and executing his elaborate revenge. He was the one driving the story forward with his actions. The adults barely appeared in the episode at all. This was Cartman's story, from beginning to end. Casa Bonita, from Season 7, had Cartman desperately trying to get invited to Kyle's birthday party at a Mexican restaurant. Cartman's schemes and Kyle's reactions drove the entire episode. The kids were the ones with goals, with plans, with agency to act on what they wanted. The episode worked because we cared about what these kids wanted, and we watched them pursue those goals. Yet, as the show went on, this dynamic started to shift. The kids began appearing in episodes where they were just watching what adults were doing, or commenting on adult situations they had no part in creating. They became vessels for the writers to express opinions about current events, rather than characters with their own desires and motivations. The perspective changed from kids experiencing the world to kids observing the world and explaining to the audience what the writers thought about it. This shift happened gradually, over many seasons. There was no single episode where it suddenly changed. Instead, over time, more and more episodes would have the kids in reactive roles rather than active ones. They would stand around talking about what was happening, rather than being the ones making things happen. They would have conversations that sounded like adults talking, rather than kids being kids. I'm a Little Bit Country, from Season 7, showed early signs of this shift. The episode dealt with the Iraq War and had the kids researching the Founding Fathers to settle a debate about patriotism and protest. Stan and Cartman had a vision of the past where they learned lessons about American values. The kids were still central to the episode, yet they were being used to deliver messages about a contemporary political issue rather than having their own kid-focused adventure. Best Friends Forever, from Season 9, dealt with the Terry Schiavo case, where a woman in a vegetative state became the center of a national debate about end-of-life care. The episode had Kenny die and end up in a coma, with Cartman and Kyle arguing about whether to keep him on life support. The kids were present in the episode and had things to do, yet the episode was really about the adult controversy playing out in the news.
The kids were being used as vehicles to comment on that controversy rather than having their own story. Cartoon Wars from Season 10 dealt with controversy over depicting the Prophet Muhammad in cartoons. The episode had Cartman trying to get Family Guy canceled because he hated the show. Yet the real focus was on debates about free speech, religious sensitivity, and media responsibility. The kids were there, yet they were speaking for the writers about these adult concerns rather than having authentic kid experiences. This trend accelerated in later seasons. By seasons 12 and 13, many episodes would have the kids appear only briefly, or have them present throughout, yet saying things no actual kids would say. They would explain political situations, analyze social trends, and make arguments that clearly came from adult writers rather than from the characters themselves. About Last Night from Season 12 showed the kids dealing with the 2008 election. They appeared in the episode and had scenes together, yet they were really just there to represent kid perspectives on adult political obsessions. They were not having their own adventure. They were reacting to what the adults around them were doing and saying things about how weird adult behavior was. The kids had become observers rather than participants. The Ring from Season 13 had Kenny taking his girlfriend to a Jonas Brothers concert. The episode satirized Disney's marketing of purity rings to young girls. Kenny was nominally the main character, yet the episode was really about adult manipulation of children's sexuality for profit. Kenny barely spoke throughout the episode. Things happened to him and around him, rather than because of his choices. The kids also started sounding different in these later episodes. In early South Park, the kids talked like kids. They said dumb things. They misunderstood situations. They had kid logic that made sense from a child's perspective, even when it was completely wrong from an adult perspective. Cartman's schemes were elaborate, yet also childish in their execution and reasoning. Kyle's moral speeches came from a place of childhood innocence, even when he was right about adult hypocrisy. In later seasons, the kids increasingly sounded like miniature adults. They would analyze situations with adult understanding. They would make arguments using adult reasoning. They would speak in complete, well-structured thoughts that expressed complex ideas clearly. Stan, in particular, became a mouthpiece who would stand in for the writers and explain what the audience was supposed to think about whatever issue the episode was addressing. There is a scene in many later episodes where Stan or Kyle will turn to the camera, or turn to another character, and deliver a speech that summarizes the moral of the story. These speeches sound nothing like how children actually talk. They are the writers speaking directly to the audience through the character. Early South Park sometimes had Kyle give speeches, yet those speeches sounded like a kid trying to articulate something he felt deeply, even if he did not have the vocabulary to express it perfectly. Later speeches sounded like editorial columns being read aloud. The kids also stopped having distinct personalities and perspectives. In early seasons, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny all saw the world differently and wanted different things. Cartman was selfish and manipulative, Kyle was moral and often frustrated by injustice, Stan was relatively normal and often caught between his friends, Kenny was poor and dealt with death constantly yet kept coming back. These different perspectives created conflict and comedy. In later seasons, Stan and Kyle became increasingly interchangeable. They would stand next to each other and have conversations where they both represented the same viewpoint, just taking turns speaking. They stopped disagreeing with each other about anything meaningful. They became two halves of the same character, both serving as the voice of reason that explained things to the audience. Cartman remained more distinct because his role was to be wrong about everything. Whatever position Stan and Kyle took, Cartman would take the opposite position so they could argue about it. Yet even Cartman stopped having kid-like reasoning for his positions. He would make political arguments that sounded like they came from adult conservative commentators, rather than from a child's warped logic. The shift away from kid-centered storytelling also meant that childhood itself stopped being a major focus of the show. Early South Park was full of episodes about kid experiences, going to school, dealing with parents, playing games, having crushes, getting in trouble. These were stories about what it was like to be a child, even if they were exaggerated and satirical. Later South Park rarely dealt with childhood experiences at all. The kids would appear in episodes about adult political controversies, adult cultural trends, adult workplace problems, adult relationship issues. The show stopped being interested in what it was like to be 8 years old, and became interested in using 8-year-olds to comment on adult concerns. Elementary school used to be a major setting for the show. Episodes would take place in classrooms, in hallways, on the playground.
The kids would deal with teachers, with homework, with school projects, with conflicts with other students. These school settings grounded the show in the kids' daily reality and reminded viewers that these were children living children's lives. In later seasons, school appeared less and less. When it did appear, it was usually as a backdrop rather than as a meaningful setting. The kids might have a scene in a classroom, yet the scene would be about them discussing some adult topic rather than about anything related to school. Teachers stopped being characters who created problems for the kids and became characters who explained plot points or delivered information. The change in how the kids functioned in episodes reflected a broader change in what South Park wanted to be. Early South Park wanted to show the world through kids' eyes and make fun of how absurd everything looked from that innocent yet uncorrupted perspective. Later, South Park wanted to comment on current events and cultural trends, and the kids were simply tools to deliver those comments. The show had stopped being about childhood and started being about whatever Trey Parker and Matt Stone wanted to say that week. This change frustrated many longtime fans who had connected with the show because of the kids and their adventures. They did not want to watch Stan and Kyle stand around explaining political situations. They wanted to watch the kids get into ridiculous situations and deal with them in funny ways. They wanted stories where the kids' choices mattered and where the kids' perspectives shaped what happened. The loss of kid-centered storytelling also made South Park feel less universal and more specifically American and topical. When the show was about childhood experiences, viewers anywhere in the world could relate to it. Kids everywhere deal with annoying siblings, unfair teachers, complicated friendships, and confusing adults. When the show became about American political controversies and news stories, it became harder for international viewers or casual viewers to engage with. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny were still present in most episodes. They still appeared in the opening credits. The show still pretended they were the main characters. Yet in practice, they had become supporting characters in their own show. They existed to facilitate stories about adult characters and adult concerns. The kids stopped being the center of South Park long before most viewers consciously realized it had happened. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The kids becoming less central to South Park coincided with one particular adult character rising to prominence in ways that would fundamentally reshape what the show was about. Section 6. Randy Marsh and the Shift in Focus. If you wanted to identify the single character whose rise to prominence most clearly shows how South Park changed, you would look at Randy Marsh. Randy went from being Stan's father, who appeared occasionally in early episodes, to being effectively the main character of South Park by the show's 20th season. This transformation reveals how the show shifted its focus from childhood chaos to adult absurdity, from innocent perspective to cynical commentary, from stories about kids navigating the world to stories about adults failing to cope with modern life. Randy Marsh, in the early seasons, was exactly what he needed to be. He was Stan's dad. He was a geologist who worked an office job. He was married to Sharon. He showed up when the plot required a parent to react to something the kids were doing. He was relatively normal and boring. Randy existed in service of Stan's stories, not the other way around. His presence in episodes was measured and purposeful, appearing when needed and staying out of the way when the kids were the focus. When Randy did appear in early episodes, he was usually being a responsible parent, or trying to be one. Volcano from Season 1 had Randy taking the boys camping and trying to protect them when the volcano erupted. Weight Gain 4000 had Randy excited about Kathy Lee Gifford visiting South Park. These early Randy appearances were brief and functional. He was part of the supporting cast that helped the world of South Park feel complete without ever threatening to take over the spotlight. There were hints of comedic potential in Randy even early on. Spontaneous Combustion from Season 3 had Randy investigating why people were randomly catching fire. He became obsessed with solving the mystery despite how absurd the situation was. The episode showed that Randy could be funny when he was allowed to pursue something and become irrationally invested in it. Yet this was still a one-time thing rather than a defining character trait that would appear again and again. The real shift began in Season 9 with The Losing Edge in April 2005. The boys were playing Little League Baseball and Randy was attending Stan's games. Randy got drunk at the games and picked fights with other parents over calls the umpire made. He started brawling in the stands and in parking lots. He took his son's baseball games more seriously than his son did, which created humor through the reversal of expectations. The episode was funny because Randy was acting like a child, while the actual children just wanted the games to be over. What made The Losing Edge significant was that it showed Randy could carry substantial portions of an episode. The episode was still primarily about the kids and their perspective on Little League Baseball, Yet Randy's storyline was memorable and showed a side of his character that had not existed before. He was not just Stan's responsible dad anymore. He was someone who could become absurdly obsessed with trivial things and lose all sense of proportion. Bloody Mary from Season 9 gave Randy even more depth. Randy got arrested for drunk driving and was forced to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. He became convinced that alcoholism was a disease that meant he had no control over his drinking. The episode satirized how people use medical diagnoses to avoid taking responsibility. Randy took the concept to absurd extremes, claiming he was powerless to stop drinking because of his disease. More Crap from Season 11 in November 2007 was the real turning point. The entire episode was about Randy producing what he believed was the largest piece of feces ever recorded. Randy became obsessed with getting official recognition for this achievement. He measured it, photographed it, contacted record keepers in Europe, and treated this accomplishment with genuine pride. The episode was entirely Randy's story. Stan barely appeared. The show had demonstrated that Randy could be the main character of an episode and carry it successfully through nothing more than his ridiculous behavior. Season 12 brought Pandemic and Pandemic 2: The Startling, where Randy forced Stan and his friends to join a Peruvian flute band to make money. Randy had seen these bands performing and decided it was a business opportunity. His scheme went wrong and led to guinea pig monsters attacking the world. The two-part episode was really about Randy's terrible judgment and his inability to admit mistakes. The kids were along for the ride in Randy's story, rather than having their own adventure. This pattern continued through the following seasons. Medicinal Fried Chicken from Season 14 in March 2010 had Randy intentionally giving himself testicular cancer so he could get medical marijuana legally. He spent the episode with massively oversized testicles that he had to carry in a wheelbarrow. The episode satirized medical marijuana laws through Randy's exploitation of them. Randy was clearly the main character. Creme Fraiche from Season 14 had Randy becoming obsessed with cooking shows after discovering the Food Network. He spent all his time watching cooking programs and trying to recreate elaborate recipes. He became sexually aroused by cooking. He neglected his wife and his job. The episode was about Randy's inability to engage with any hobby in a normal, moderate way. By Season 16, Randy was appearing as the central character in multiple episodes per season. Sarcastaball had Randy inventing a new form of football that was completely non-violent. A Nightmare on FaceTime had Randy buying a doomed Blockbuster video rental store, despite it being well into the era of streaming services. Gluten-free Ebola from Season 18 had Randy discovering he was gluten intolerant and moving his family to the country. Randy had become the character the writers used when they wanted to satirize how adults responded to trends and cultural panics. What Randy represented was a fundamental shift in what South Park wanted to satirize. Early South Park satirized the world from the perspective of kids who had no power and found adults ridiculous. Randy-focused South Park satirized the world from inside adult panic and obsession. The target changed from institutions and authority figures to the everyday absurdity of how adults respond to modern life, despite supposedly having wisdom and experience. Randy's rise coincided with South Park becoming more interested in current events and topical satire. Kids could not naturally engage with most news stories in authentic ways. How would 8-year-olds have informed opinions about political scandals or economic policies? Randy could engage with these topics directly. Randy could have opinions about politics, could get swept up in cultural trends, could make terrible decisions based on whatever was in the news. Randy became the vehicle for reacting to whatever Parker and Stone wanted to comment on. Randy's character became more exaggerated as he took on a bigger role. Early Randy was a normal person who occasionally did something dumb. Later Randy was a complete lunatic who took everything to absurd extremes. He could not have a hobby without becoming obsessed to the point of ruining his life. He could not try something new without losing all perspective. Randy stopped being a character who seemed like he could exist in reality and became a cartoon character in the most literal sense. The show used Randy to explore what happens when middle-aged men never grow up and never gain wisdom from their experiences. Randy would make the same mistakes over and over. He would learn lessons at the end of episodes, yet be exactly the same in the next episode, with no memory of what he had learned. His inability to mature made him perfect for satirizing how adults keep repeating the same patterns, despite having decades of experience. Randy's prominence also reflected Trey Parker and Matt Stone's own aging. When they created South Park in their 20s, they were closer to childhood and could write kids' perspectives authentically. As they got older and entered middle age themselves, they became more interested in satirizing adult experiences. Randy became their avatar for exploring middle-aged frustration, midlife crises, and the panic of realizing you are not young anymore, yet have not become wiser. The shift to Randy-focused episodes changed the tone of South Park. Kid-focused episodes had a sense of innocence even when dealing with dark topics. The kids were discovering how the world worked and reacting with genuine surprise. Randy-focused episodes had a sense of exhaustion and cynicism. Randy knew how the world worked and chose to be stupid anyway. The humor became more bitter and less playful. Randy's rise also meant South Park increasingly told stories about adult concerns rather than universal human experiences. Episodes about Randy dealing with marijuana legalization, gluten trends, or cryptocurrency were specifically about adult fads that kids would have no authentic connection to. The show became more niche in what it wanted to talk about. Fans had mixed reactions to Randy's increased prominence. Some viewers found Randy hilarious and enjoyed episodes where he went to absurd extremes. Randy episodes were often very funny and featured memorable moments. Yet other fans felt that Randy taking over meant South Park had abandoned what made it special. They wanted the show to be about kids being kids. The Randy era featured different settings than kid-focused episodes had used. Randy episodes took place at his workplace, in adult social settings, in locations kids would not naturally go. The world of the show expanded beyond elementary school and residential streets to include more of the adult world of South Park. By season 19 and beyond, Randy had become so central that calling him a supporting character felt inaccurate. Multiple episodes per season would focus primarily or entirely on Randy, with Stan appearing only briefly, if at all. The show had effectively recast Randy as the protagonist, even though it never officially acknowledged this change. What made Randy's takeover particularly significant was that it happened gradually. Early Randy episodes were still balanced with plenty of kid-focused content. Yet season by season, Randy appeared more, and episodes about the kids appeared less. The accumulation of small changes resulted in a fundamentally different show. Randy's prominence made South Park feel less distinctive compared to other animated comedies. Other shows featured bumbling adult protagonists. The Simpsons had Homer, Family Guy had Peter. What had made South Park special was that it was about kids. Once it became another show about a dumb adult causing chaos, it lost some of what had separated it from everything else. The Randy era represents the show's evolution from rebellious outsider comedy to mainstream satirical commentary. Randy was not challenging authority or speaking truth to power. He was embodying the foolishness of ordinary people who thought they understood the world, yet clearly did not. The satire became less about challenging institutions and more about laughing at how dumb everyone is. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Randy's rise to prominence was made possible by a production change that allowed South Park to respond to current events faster than any show in television history. Yet this newfound speed would reshape what South Park could be. Section 7. Serialization changes the rhythm. South Park was built on the idea that each episode was its own complete story. You could watch any episode without having seen the ones before it and still understand everything that was happening. Kenny would die in one episode and be alive again in the next without explanation. Conflicts would be resolved by the end of each episode, and everyone would forget what happened. This episodic structure was fundamental to how South Park worked and how viewers related to it. When the show started experimenting with serialization and continuity, it changed the viewing experience in ways that went far beyond just telling longer stories. The earliest seasons of South Park reset completely after each episode. Characters would not remember what happened in previous episodes. Relationships would return to their default state. The show existed in a perpetual present where nothing had lasting consequences beyond individual episodes. This allowed the show enormous freedom to do whatever it wanted in any given episode without worrying about how it affected future episodes. Cartman could do something absolutely horrible in one episode, and everyone would be friends with him again in the next episode, because the show simply moved on. This episodic approach had major advantages. Viewers could watch episodes in any order and still enjoy them. Syndication was easy because television stations could show episodes randomly without confusing audiences. Missing several weeks of the show did not matter because you could come back and pick up right where you left off. Each episode delivered complete satisfaction within 22 minutes, without requiring investment in ongoing storylines. This accessibility was part of what made South Park so popular and so easy to share with friends who had never watched before. The episodic structure also created a specific pacing that fans remember fondly. Episodes moved quickly through their plots without dwelling on setup for future payoffs. Every minute of an episode was focused on the immediate story being told. The show prioritized delivering jokes and satire in the present moment, rather than building towards something that would happen later. This fast pace meant episodes felt packed with content, and never wasted time on scenes that existed only to establish things that would matter in future episodes. South Park maintained this episodic approach for most of its run. Individual episodes in seasons 15 and 16 would occasionally reference events from previous episodes, yet these were usually just jokes or callbacks rather than actual continuity. The show would acknowledge its own history for comedy purposes, without being bound by that history. Characters would mention things that happened seasons earlier as a way of surprising longtime fans who remembered those episodes, yet the references were never required to understand what was currently happening. The first real experiment with serialization came in season 18, which aired from September to December 2014. The season was promoted as having a continuous storyline running through all 10 episodes. Characters would reference events from earlier episodes in the season. Conflicts established in early episodes would continue through later ones. Storylines would build and develop across multiple weeks rather than resolving immediately. This was a major departure from how South Park had always worked. Season 18 followed multiple ongoing plots that wove through the episodes. One storyline dealt with gentrification in South Park, with new restaurants and businesses changing the character of the town. Another storyline followed Randy starting a food truck. A third storyline dealt with the town getting Google Fiber internet and the cultural changes that brought. These storylines did not develop in every episode, yet they appeared regularly enough that viewers needed to watch episodes in order to understand what was happening. The season built toward a finale where all these storylines came together. Characters made choices based on what had happened in previous episodes. Conflicts that began early in the season reached conclusions in the finale. The season had an actual arc, with beginning, middle, and end, rather than being 10 separate episodes that happened to air consecutively. This was something South Park had never attempted before on this scale. Season 19 continued this serialized approach and pushed it even further. The entire season revolved around advertising, political correctness, and gentrification. Every episode connected to these themes and to storylines that ran through the whole season. Characters dealt with consequences from previous episodes. Running jokes developed across multiple weeks. The season told one long story, broken into 10 parts, rather than 10 individual stories. This serialized approach changed how South Park felt to watch. Instead of each episode being its own self-contained experience, episodes became chapters in a longer story. Individual episodes often ended on cliffhangers or unresolved situations that would continue in the next episode. The satisfaction of closure that viewers used to get from each episode was delayed until the season finale. This required a different kind of engagement from viewers who were used to episodic storytelling. The serialization meant jokes and references that appeared in one episode would pay off in later episodes. A seemingly throwaway line in episode 3 would become important in episode 7. Characters would mention events from earlier in the season and expect viewers to remember what they were talking about. The humor became more layered and more dependent on viewers having watched everything in order. This rewarded dedicated fans who watched every episode as it aired, yet it made the show less accessible to casual viewers who might tune in occasionally. Missing an episode became a real problem for the first time in South Park's history. If you missed episode 4 of season 19, you would be confused by references and plot developments in episode 5. The show was no longer designed to be watched casually or occasionally. It required commitment and consistent viewing to understand what was happening. This was a significant shift for a show that had always been easy to jump into at any point. Serialization also changed the pacing of individual episodes. Episodes that were part of longer arcs felt different from self-contained episodes. They spent time setting up things that would pay off later, rather than delivering immediate payoffs. They included scenes that existed primarily to advance ongoing plots, rather than to be funny in the moment. The density of jokes per episode decreased because some of the runtime was devoted to serialized storytelling rather than pure comedy. The serialized seasons also relied more heavily on topical references to current events than previous seasons had. Season 19 dealt with political correctness debates, presidential campaigns, and cultural controversies that were happening in 2015. These references were woven throughout the serialized plot, which meant the entire season became tied to that specific moment in time. The serialization and the topicality reinforced each other in ways that made both more pronounced.
Viewer reactions to serialization were mixed, and often divided along generational lines. Some fans enjoyed the ambition and complexity of telling longer stories. They appreciated being able to follow character development and plot threads across multiple episodes. They felt the serialization showed that South Park was evolving and taking risks with its format. These viewers saw serialization as the show maturing and trying something new after almost 20 years of episodic storytelling. Other fans strongly disliked the serialized approach and felt it betrayed what South Park was supposed to be. They missed being able to watch any episode and immediately enjoy it without homework. They felt the serialization made the show less funny because episodes spent too much time on plot and not enough time on jokes. They argued that South Park worked best as self-contained episodes, and that serialization played to the show's weaknesses rather than its strengths. The serialization also revealed limitations in how South Park was produced. The show's famous 6-day production schedule, where episodes were made in less than a week, worked perfectly for episodic storytelling, where each episode stood alone. Creating serialized stories required more planning and more coordination across multiple episodes. The creators had to know where storylines were going and how they would develop. This conflicted with South Park's tradition of responding quickly to current events and changing episodes at the last minute. Season 20, in 2016, continued the serialized approach and expanded it even further. The entire season was one continuous story about internet trolling, political division, and the 2016 presidential election. Every episode advanced the ongoing plot. The season could not be watched out of order at all, because each episode depended entirely on what happened in previous episodes. This was the most ambitious serialization South Park had ever attempted. The commitment to serialization in Season 20 created significant problems for the show. The season was built around the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win the 2016 presidential election. When Donald Trump won instead, the creators had to scramble to adjust the remaining episodes. The surprise election result disrupted the carefully planned season arc in ways that exposed how serialization limited the show's flexibility. South Park had always prided itself on being able to respond to anything. Yet the serialized format meant they were locked into storylines they could not easily change. After Season 20, South Park pulled back significantly from serialization. Seasons 21 and beyond returned to mostly episodic storytelling, with occasional continuity. The show seemed to have recognized that serialization was not playing to its strengths. Individual episodes stood alone again. Characters stopped carrying baggage from previous episodes. The reset button returned. The show was acknowledging, through its format, that the serialization experiment had not worked as well as hoped. The brief period of heavy serialization from seasons 18 through 20 represents a distinct era in South Park's evolution. The show was trying to do something different and to tell stories in a new way. The experiment produced some interesting episodes and showed the creators were still willing to take risks after 2 decades. Yet it also revealed that some aspects of South Park's original formula existed for good reasons, and that changing them had costs. Serialization changed how jokes worked in South Park. In episodic seasons, jokes were self-contained and immediately comprehensible. In serialized seasons, jokes often relied on callbacks to earlier episodes or references to ongoing plots. The humor became more insular and more dependent on viewers being deeply familiar with what had happened previously. This made the comedy less accessible and less immediately funny to people who are not watching obsessively. The serialization also changed the relationship between South Park and its audience. Episodic South Park treated viewers as people who might watch occasionally when they felt like it. Localized South Park demanded that viewers commit to watching every episode in order and remember everything that happened. This was asking for a different kind of engagement that not all viewers wanted to give. Looking back, the serialization period feels like South Park trying to evolve in a direction that did not suit what it was best at. The show was at its strongest when doing sharp, self-contained satirical stories that could be enjoyed independently. The serialization made the show more like prestige television dramas, where ongoing plots and character arcs were the point. South Park was not built for that kind of storytelling, and the attempt to force it into that mold created more problems than it solved. The return to episodic storytelling after Season 20 showed the creators learning from experience. They tried something ambitious, recognized it was not working as well as their traditional approach, and adjusted accordingly. This flexibility to admit when something is not working and return to what does work is part of why South Park has survived for so long. The show is willing to experiment, yet also willing to abandon experiments that do not serve it well.
Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown.
The serialization experiments coincided with another significant change in how South Park approached satire, as the show became increasingly focused on immediate reactions to whatever was currently happening in the news. Section 8. Satire becomes tied to the news cycle. One of the most significant changes in South Park's approach to comedy was how the show became increasingly focused on reacting to current events as quickly as possible. Early South Park satirized general patterns of human behavior and timeless aspects of American culture. Later South Park became obsessed with responding to whatever was happening in the news that specific week. This shift from timeless satire to topical commentary changed what South Park episodes were about and how long they remained funny and relevant after they first aired. South Park always had some connection to current events, even in its earliest seasons. Episodes would reference movies that were currently in theaters or celebrities who were currently famous. The show was never completely disconnected from contemporary culture. Yet these references were usually surface-level jokes, rather than the entire point of episodes. An early episode might make a joke about a current celebrity, yet the episode would be about something broader that did not require knowing who that celebrity was to understand the satire. The show's production method made responding to current events possible in ways that other animated shows could not match. Most animated television shows take months to produce a single episode. Scripts are written, designs are created, animation is produced, and voices are recorded, all on schedules that require planning everything far in advance. South Park developed a production method where episodes could be made in 6 days, from conception to broadcast. This allowed the show to respond to events that happened on Monday and have an episode about them on air by Wednesday of the same week. This 6-day production schedule was impressive from a technical standpoint and demonstrated the dedication and skill of everyone working on South Park. The speed at which they could produce episodes was genuinely remarkable. Yet the ability to respond so quickly to current events also created pressure to do so. If South Park could make an episode about something that happened 3 days ago, should they? Just because they could respond immediately did not necessarily mean they should. Yet the temptation to be the fastest and most current satirical voice became hard to resist. Season 9 in 2005 showed the shift toward more immediate topicality beginning to accelerate. Best Friends Forever aired in March 2005 and dealt with the Terry Schiavo case, which was dominating news coverage at that exact moment. Terry Schiavo was a woman in a persistent vegetative state whose family was fighting in court over whether to remove her feeding tube. The case became a massive political controversy involving Congress and the president. South Park's episode aired while this was still happening, making the satire feel immediate and urgent, yet also tying the episode permanently to that specific news story. Viewers watching Best Friends Forever in March 2005 understood exactly what was being satirized, because the news was full of Schiavo coverage. Kenny in a coma, with Cartman fighting to keep him alive, clearly represented the real-world debate about right-to-die issues. The episode won an Emmy Award and was praised for addressing a difficult topic with humor. Yet viewers watching the episode years later would need to research what the Terry Schiavo case was to fully understand the episode. The topicality made it powerful at the time, yet also dated it in ways that timeless satire would not have. Trapped in the Closet, from season 9 in November 2005, showed South Park taking on Scientology directly. The episode explained Scientology beliefs, showed Tom Cruise literally hiding in Stan's closet, and made specific references to current celebrity Scientologists. The episode was brave and generated enormous controversy. Isaac Hayes quit the show over it. Comedy Central initially pulled it from reruns. The episode demonstrated South Park's willingness to attack powerful targets, regardless of consequences. Yet, Trapped in the Closet was also deeply tied to 2005 specifically. Tom Cruise was at a particular point in his career, and his relationship with Scientology was receiving particular media attention. The episode worked perfectly in that moment because it tapped into existing public interest and controversy. Viewers watching years later would still find it funny. Yet, they would be watching it more as a historical document of 2005 celebrity culture than as timeless satire. Season 10 in 2006 brought the Muhammad cartoon controversy episodes. These episodes dealt directly with debates about depicting the Prophet Muhammad in cartoons, following the Danish newspaper controversy, where cartoons of Muhammad led to protests and threats of violence. South Park inserted itself directly into this controversy by showing Muhammad in their episode and challenging threats against free speech. The episodes were clearly responding to something happening in the world right at that moment, and using South Park's platform to take a position on it. The Muhammad episodes showed both the power and the limitations of topical immediacy. The episodes were culturally significant because they were intervening in a live controversy and were willing to face potential consequences for defending free speech principles. They mattered in ways that less topical episodes might not have. Yet they also required viewers to know about the Danish cartoon controversy and the threats surrounding it to fully understand what South Park was doing and why it was significant. This pattern of immediate topicality continued and intensified in later seasons. By seasons 15 and 16, multiple episodes per season would be direct responses to news stories from that same week. Raising the Bar, from season 16, dealt with James Cameron and Honey Boo Boo, both of whom were specifically relevant in 2012. A Nightmare on FaceTime featured Randy buying a Blockbuster video store despite streaming having made video rental obsolete, which was topical to exactly when Blockbuster was failing as a business. Season 18 in 2014 was built around controversies about Gamergate, social media outrage culture, and debates about political correctness that were dominating online discourse at that exact moment. The entire serialized season was responding to things happening in 2014. Viewers would need to remember what was being argued about on Twitter and Reddit in fall 2014 to understand why episodes were focusing on the specific issues they addressed. The satire was completely tied to contemporary moment. Season 19 in 2015 dealt with political correctness debates, gentrification, advertising, and other topics that were specific hot buttons in 2015. Season 20 in 2016 was entirely about the 2016 presidential election and internet trolling. These seasons were not trying to be timeless. They were explicitly trying to be of the moment and to respond to what people were talking about right then. This topical focus meant that South Park episodes started aging differently than they had before. Early South Park episodes from the late 1990s and early 2000s could be watched decades later and still worked because they were about universal human experiences and timeless patterns. Make Love, Not Warcraft, from season 10 in 2006, worked as satire of video game culture and as a story about kids getting obsessed with an activity. Viewers in 2025 could watch it and understand it even if they never played World of Warcraft because the underlying ideas were not specific to 2006. Episodes that were immediate responses to specific 2015 news stories did not age as well. Watching them years later required knowing what was happening in 2015 to understand what was being satirized. The episodes assumed viewers had baseline knowledge of current events that became historical knowledge, requiring research. This limited how well the episodes worked for casual viewers or younger viewers who were not following news in 2015. The topical focus also changed how South Park researched and wrote episodes. Creating timeless satire requires understanding deep patterns in human behavior and culture. Creating topical satire requires knowing what happened in the news this week and having opinions about it. The research shifted from thinking about universal truths to scrolling through Twitter and reading news articles. The writing shifted from constructing stories that explored ideas to constructing arguments about specific events. This change in approach affected the types of humor that appeared in episodes. Timeless satire creates humor through exaggeration of universal patterns. You take something everyone recognizes and push it to absurd extremes that reveal truth about the pattern itself. Topical satire creates humor through commentary on specific situations. You take something from the news and show what is ridiculous about it specifically. Both can be funny, yet they create different viewing experiences and different relationships with audiences. Topical satire also requires more work from viewers. You cannot just watch and laugh. You need to know what is being referenced to understand why something is supposed to be funny or what point is being made. This additional cognitive load can make topical satire feel more like homework than entertainment. Viewers might respect the intelligence required, yet also find it exhausting to keep up with. The shift toward topicality was also driven by changing expectations about what satire should do. In an era of social media where everyone was expected to have immediate opinions about everything, South Park felt pressure to weigh in on controversies as they happened. Waiting to develop timeless satire about patterns might seem like being slow or irrelevant when everyone else was commenting on Twitter in real time. The show was responding to a cultural shift where being first mattered more than being timeless. Yet this created a trap where South Park had to keep running faster to stay relevant. If the show took a week off or did an episode that was not about current events, it might seem like the show was missing the conversation. The pressure to be constantly topical meant the show could never step back and do episodes that were just funny stories, unconnected to what was happening in the news. The topicality became expected, and then became required. The most significant consequence of topical focus was that South Park episodes became disposable in ways they never were before. Early South Park episodes were rewatchable because the humor and ideas were not tied to specific moments. Later topical episodes were designed to be watched once when they aired and then largely forgotten because they were about things that stopped mattering as soon as the news cycle moved on. The episodes were created to be consumed and then replaced by next week's equally topical episode. This disposability changed South Park's cultural footprint. Early episodes became classics that people quoted and rewatched for years. Later topical episodes were watched when they aired, discussed briefly online, and then mostly disappeared from conversation. The show was generating less lasting content and more temporary content designed for immediate consumption. The creators themselves seemed aware of these issues. In interviews, Trey Parker and Matt Stone discussed feeling exhausted by the pressure to be topical every single week. They talked about how draining it was to constantly follow the news and to feel obligated to have opinions about everything. The topical approach that had given them the ability to be culturally relevant was also burning them out creatively. By season 21 in 2017, South Park started pulling back somewhat from pure topicality. Episodes still referenced current events, yet they were less likely to be entirely about one specific news story from that week. The show was trying to find balance between being current and being timeless. Later seasons have continued this trend, with episodes that acknowledge current culture without being completely dependent on knowing specific news stories. The topical era represents South Park responding to pressure to be constantly relevant in an age of social media and immediate reactions. The show proved it could move faster than any other comedy and could insert itself into any controversy. Yet the cost was that episodes became more ephemeral and less rewatchable. The trade-off between immediacy and longevity was not always worth it. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The shift toward topical immediacy and away from timeless satire created divisions among South Park's audience that revealed how different viewers were looking for different things from the show. Section 9. Audience division and nostalgia. The changes that happened to South Park over the years created something that rarely happens with long-running television shows. The fanbase split into distinct groups that disagreed fundamentally about what South Park was supposed to be, and when it was at its best. These disagreements were not just casual preferences. They represented genuinely different experiences of watching the show and genuinely different ideas about what made South Park special in the first place. The first major divide was between fans who believed the golden age ended after the movie in 2004 and fans who believed it continued well into the 2000s. The fans who sided with the movie being the endpoint would point to seasons 1 through 7 as the pure essence of what South Park was meant to be. They would talk about how those seasons had the perfect balance of crude humor and intelligent satire. They would mention specific episodes like Scott Tenorman Must Die, or Make Love Not Warcraft, or Trapped in the Closet, as proof that early South Park achieved something later seasons could never match. These fans felt that once the show moved past season 10, something fundamental changed that could never be recovered. They would point to how the kids stopped being the center of the stories. They would mention how Randy became too prominent. They would talk about how the show became too focused on current events and lost its timeless quality. When they watched newer episodes, they would compare them unfavorably to what came before. They would say things like, "This would never have happened in the early seasons," or "This is not what South Park used to be." The second group of fans disagreed completely. They believed that South Park remained excellent well into the 2000s, and that the show actually improved in many ways. These fans would point to episodes from seasons 12, 13, and 14 as being just as good as anything from the earlier years. They would mention The China Problem, or Fish Sticks, or You Have Zero Friends, as proof that later South Park could still be brilliant. They appreciated the show's willingness to evolve and change, rather than repeating the same formulas forever. These fans saw the increased focus on current events as a strength rather than a weakness. They liked that South Park engaged directly with what was happening in the world. They appreciated that the show took risks and tried new approaches like serialization. They felt that fans who only praised early seasons were being nostalgic and were refusing to acknowledge that the show had grown and matured. When these fans watched older episodes, they sometimes found them less sophisticated than they remembered. A third group of fans emerged who had discovered South Park through streaming services or YouTube compilations years after episodes originally aired. These fans did not experience the show chronologically. They might have watched season 15 before watching season 5. They might have seen Make Love Not Warcraft and Tweak X Craig in the same week, despite those episodes being separated by a decade. These fans often had a completely different perspective because they were not anchored to any particular era as being the definitive version of the show. This third group would sometimes surprise longtime fans by loving episodes that were considered weak, or by being indifferent to episodes that were considered classics. They had not lived through the changes in real time, so they did not feel betrayed when the show evolved. They simply saw South Park as a large collection of episodes with varying quality, and they picked out what they liked without worrying about which era it came from. The divisions became particularly intense online, where fans would debate endlessly about when South Park stopped being good. Reddit threads and forum discussions would devolve into arguments about whether Season 8 or Season 11 or Season 15 was the real turning point. People would create elaborate ranking systems and tier lists that placed seasons in order from best to worst. These rankings almost never agreed with each other because everyone had different criteria for what made an episode or season good. Some fans cared most about the comedy and judged episodes purely on how funny they were. These fans might rate seasons 10 and 11 highly because those seasons had consistently strong jokes, even if the social commentary was heavier than before. Other fans cared most about the satire and judged episodes based on how effectively they addressed cultural or political issues. These fans might rate season 14 highly because of episodes like You Have Zero Friends that satirized Facebook, or It's a Jersey Thing that made fun of reality television culture. Still, other fans cared most about the characters and judged episodes based on how well they developed Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. These fans would often dislike later seasons because the kids appeared less frequently and had less agency in the stories. They wanted episodes where the boys went on adventures and dealt with problems from their perspective as children. When Randy took over as the main character in many episodes, these fans felt like the show had lost sight of what made it work. The disagreements were made more complicated by nostalgia. Fans who had watched South Park as teenagers in the early 2000s had powerful emotional connections to those episodes. Those were the episodes they had watched with friends, quoted at school, and bonded over during a formative time in their lives. When they rewatched those episodes as adults, they were not just watching comedy. They were revisiting a time when life was simpler and they had fewer responsibilities. This nostalgia made it nearly impossible for newer episodes to compete fairly. An episode from season 19 might be objectively well-written and funny, yet it could never replicate the feeling of watching Make Love Not Warcraft for the first time in 2006, when World of Warcraft was at its cultural peak and you were 16 years old. The newer episode was not worse necessarily, it just did not have the emotional weight of memory attached to it. Some fans recognized this nostalgia and tried to account for it when evaluating episodes. They would deliberately rewatch old episodes they remembered loving to see if they still held up without the nostalgia factor. Sometimes they discovered that episodes they remembered as brilliant were actually just okay. Other times they found that episodes really were as good as they remembered. This process of reevaluation created even more disagreement as fans came to different conclusions about what held up. The streaming era added another layer to these divisions. When South Park became available on services like Hulu and later Paramount Plus, new viewers could watch the entire series at their own pace. This created a phenomenon where someone might watch all of Season 7 in a weekend and then immediately start Season 8. They would experience transitions that original viewers had lived through over months or years in a matter of days. This compressed viewing experience changed how the show's evolution felt. Changes that had seemed gradual when they happened in real time felt sudden when you binged through seasons. The shift toward topical satire that had developed slowly over seasons 9, 10, and 11 felt jarring when you watched those seasons back to back. Some fans who discovered the show through streaming reported feeling whiplash at how different later seasons were from earlier ones. The divisions also reflected generational differences. Millennials who had watched South Park from the beginning tended to prefer the earlier seasons. They had grown up with the show and felt ownership over what it was supposed to be. Gen Z viewers who discovered South Park in the 2000s
often preferred later seasons because those were the seasons that addressed issues and used humor styles that felt more relevant to them. They did not necessarily care about episodes from 2002 because those episodes referenced a cultural moment they were too young to remember. Parker and Stone were aware of these divisions and occasionally addressed them. In interviews, they would acknowledge that some fans preferred earlier seasons, while other fans enjoyed the newer direction. They would sometimes express frustration that certain fans seemed determined to hate anything new the show did simply because it was different from the past. Yet they also seemed to understand that the changes they had made were significant enough to justify fans feeling divided. The show itself occasionally made jokes about these divisions. There were episodes that referenced how things used to be different, or how the town of South Park had changed over time. These moments could be read as the creators acknowledging that the show had evolved in ways that not everyone appreciated. Yet the show never directly addressed the controversy about whether newer seasons were worse than older seasons. What made these divisions particularly interesting was that both sides had legitimate points. Fans who preferred early South Park were correct that those seasons had a different energy and approach. The comedy was less constrained by current events. The kids were the clear protagonists. The episodes had more absurdist humor that came from creative imagination rather than from commenting on reality. These qualities really did make early South Park distinctive and special. Yet fans who defended later South Park were also correct that the show continued to produce excellent episodes, and that some of its most ambitious work came in later years. Episodes like You're Getting Old from season 15 dealt with depression and change in ways the show had never attempted before. The serialization experiments, while controversial, showed a willingness to take creative risks. The topical satire, while sometimes dated, captured specific cultural moments with sharp insight. The inability of these two groups to agree on basic facts about the show's quality demonstrated something important about how we experience and remember television. Our perception of whether something is good depends heavily on when we watched it, what we were going through in our lives at that time, and what we wanted from the entertainment we consumed. Two people could watch the exact same episode and come away with completely different opinions because they were bringing different expectations and experiences to their viewing. The divisions within the South Park fanbase also raise questions about what happens when a show runs for so long that it outlives its original conception. South Park in 2024 was a fundamentally different show from South Park in 1999. It had different goals, different strengths, and different weaknesses. Yet it still had the same name and the same characters. This created a situation where people were arguing about whether South Park was good without agreeing on what South Park even was anymore. Some fans dealt with this by simply deciding that their preferred era of the show was the only version that counted. They would say that South Park ended after the movie, or after season 10, or after season 12. Everything after that cutoff point was not real South Park in their minds. Other fans rejected this approach and insisted that all of South Park counted equally, and that judging it required accounting for its full evolution over decades. These disagreements were never resolved, and likely never will be resolved. The divisions became a permanent part of what it meant to be a South Park fan. When you told someone you loved South Park, the natural follow-up question became, which seasons? Your answer to that question revealed what you valued in comedy and what you thought the show was supposed to be doing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These divided reactions from fans reflected something important. The creators themselves had changed over the decades, and their personal growth directly shaped what South Park became. Section 10. Creators growing alongside the show. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were in their 20s when they created South Park. Parker was 27 years old when the first episode aired in August 1997. Stone was 26. They were young men with a specific sense of humor and a specific worldview that came from being young men in the 1990s. Their youth shaped everything about what early South Park was. The show's anarchic energy, its willingness to offend everyone, and its fundamental belief that taking anything too seriously was stupid, all reflected the attitudes of creators who were still figuring out who they were. The show was born out of Parker and Stone's college friendship and their shared love of making crude animated shorts. Before South Park, they had created a short film called The Spirit of Christmas that featured 4 boys and a fight between Jesus and Santa Claus. That short became a viral sensation through early internet distribution and caught the attention of Comedy Central executives. The network gave them a chance to turn this concept into a full series. Early South Park reflected the creative freedom of young creators who had nothing to lose. Parker and Stone could make jokes about anything because they were not yet established figures with reputations to protect. They could offend viewers because they did not yet have a large fan base to disappoint.
They could be irresponsible with their satire because they were not yet seen as important cultural commentators. This freedom allowed them to create something genuinely fresh and shocking. As the years passed, Parker and Stone aged along with their audience. By season 10 in 2006, they were in their mid-30s. They were no longer the young outsiders making a scrappy cable show. They were successful television creators with wealth, influence, and responsibilities. They had won Emmy Awards. They had made a major motion picture. They were invited to speak at events and give their opinions on culture and politics. This change in status affected how they approached South Park. The shift was gradual enough that it was not immediately obvious. Yet looking back, the pattern was clear. As Parker and Stone got older, the show started to reflect the concerns and perspectives of adults rather than the perspectives of perpetual adolescents. The show became more interested in politics and social issues. It became less interested in pure absurdist humor. The satire became more pointed and more serious in its intent. This evolution was not necessarily negative. In some ways, Parker and Stone became better at what they did as they gained more experience and skill. The writing in later seasons was often more sophisticated than it had been in season 1. The jokes were more layered. The social commentary was sharper and more informed. Episodes like You're Getting Old demonstrated that the creators had developed the ability to explore genuinely complex emotions in ways they could not have done when they were younger. Yet something was also lost in this maturation. Early South Park had a manic energy that came from creators who were making it up as they went along. They would throw anything into an episode if it seemed funny. They were not worried about whether their satire was consistent or whether their message was clear. They just wanted to make people laugh and maybe shock them a little. Later, South Park felt more calculated and more concerned with saying something meaningful. Parker and Stone's personal lives also changed in ways that affected the show. Both creators got married and had children. These experiences gave them new perspectives on family life and parenting. Some fans speculated that having children made Parker and Stone less interested in writing about kids having adventures. Others thought it made them more aware of how children actually think and behave, which made it harder to write the exaggerated child characters they had created. The creators' political views also evolved over time. In early interviews, Parker and Stone described themselves as libertarians who hated both political parties equally. They made fun of liberals and conservatives with equal enthusiasm. This attitude was reflected in episodes like Douche and Turd from season 8, which suggested that voting was pointless because all politicians were terrible. The message was essentially that caring about politics was stupid and you should just laugh at how dumb everyone was. By the 2000s, Parker and Stone's political stance seemed more complicated and less purely cynical. They still made fun of all sides, yet the satire felt more targeted. Episodes about Trump and the 2016 election had a different tone than episodes about earlier political figures. The show seemed genuinely frustrated with what was happening in American politics, rather than just amused by the absurdity. This reflected that the creators themselves were no longer detached observers. They had become people with strong opinions about how the country should be run. The creators also became more aware of their cultural influence and more thoughtful about the impact their show had. In early years, they seemed unconcerned with whether South Park affected how people thought about issues. They were just making comedy for its own sake. Later, they acknowledged in interviews that millions of people watched their show and that what they said mattered. This awareness created pressure to be more responsible with their platform. This pressure sometimes resulted in self-censorship that would not have happened in early seasons. Parker and Stone would decide not to make certain jokes because they were worried about the consequences. They would think more carefully about how their satire might be interpreted. They would try to make sure their episodes had clear messages that would not be misunderstood. This was probably wise and mature, yet it also meant the show had lost some of its reckless spontaneity. The workload of producing South Park also took its toll over the years. Parker and Stone had maintained their 6-day production schedule for over 2 decades. Every week during production, they would write, record, animate, and deliver a new episode in less than a week. This schedule was exhausting and stressful even when they were young. As they got older, it became harder to maintain that pace. In interviews from the 2000s, both creators talked openly about how tired they were. They mentioned that the 6-day schedule had become a burden rather than an exciting challenge. They discussed taking breaks from the show or possibly ending it entirely because they were burned out. The fact that they kept going despite this exhaustion showed their commitment, yet it also raised questions about whether the quality suffered when the creators were creatively depleted. The relationship between Parker and Stone also evolved over decades of working together. They had been friends since college, and their partnership was the foundation of everything South Park was. Yet maintaining any relationship for 25 years requires work and adaptation. In early interviews, they seemed to have very similar views on almost everything. Later interviews suggested they sometimes disagreed about creative direction or what the show should be doing. These disagreements never became serious enough to threaten their partnership, yet they hinted that the perfect creative unity of early years had become more complicated. Parker seemed to be the primary creative voice behind most episodes, with Stone taking a more supportive role. This division of labor worked for them, yet it meant that later, South Park increasingly reflected Parker's individual perspective, rather than a true collaboration between two equal partners. The success of South Park also gave Parker and Stone opportunities to work on other projects. They created the Broadway musical The Book of Mormon, which became a massive critical and commercial success. They developed other television projects and pursued various creative interests outside of South Park. These experiences enriched them as artists and gave them new perspectives. Yet every hour spent on other projects was an hour not spent on South Park. The financial success of South Park also changed the creators' relationship with the show. Parker and Stone had become extremely wealthy from South Park's success over decades. They did not need to keep making the show for financial reasons. They could have retired comfortably at any point. The fact that they continued working on South Park meant they were doing it because they wanted to or felt obligated to, not because they needed the money. This dynamic affected their creative choices. When you are working on something because you need the income, you might make compromises or do things that do not excite you because you have to. When you are working on something, despite being financially secure, you only do what you genuinely want to do. This meant later, South Park reflected Parker and Stone's personal interests more directly than early South Park had. If they wanted to make episodes about current events, they did. If they wanted to focus on Randy instead of the kids, they did. They had the freedom to make South Park whatever they wanted it to be. This creative freedom was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed Parker and Stone to take risks and try new approaches without worrying about whether they would get canceled. Yet it also meant they did not have external constraints that might have pushed them to maintain aspects of the show that fans loved. No one could tell them that Randy had taken over too much, or that the show needed to go back to being episodic. They were in complete control, which meant the show evolved according to their personal growth rather than audience demands. The aging of Parker and Stone also meant they were less in touch with youth culture than they had been when they created the show. In 1997, they were close enough to their own childhoods to remember what it felt like to be a kid. They understood the social dynamics of elementary school because they had experienced them relatively recently. By 2015, they were in their 40s and multiple decades removed from childhood. They were now trying to write about kids' experiences from the perspective of middle-aged adults. This distance showed in subtle ways. The kids in later seasons sometimes talked and acted more like small adults than like actual children. They would discuss political issues or social problems in ways that demonstrated adult understanding. The show sometimes felt like it was using children as vessels for adult commentary, rather than genuinely exploring childhood. This was a natural consequence of creators who were no longer young men trying to remember what childhood felt like. Parker and Stone also became less interested in pushing boundaries for the sake of pushing boundaries. Early South Park seemed to delight in being offensive and shocking viewers. The creators seemed to enjoy the controversy their show generated. Later, they became more selective about when to be shocking. They would still push boundaries occasionally, yet the shock was usually in service of making a point, rather than just for the sake of being outrageous. They had matured past the adolescent impulse to offend people simply to prove they could. The creators' relationship with their own creation became complicated. In some ways, South Park was their greatest achievement and the thing they would always be known for. Yet it was also something that had consumed 25 years of their lives and prevented them from being seen as anything other than the South Park guys. They sometimes expressed frustration in interviews about being trapped by their own success. They wanted to do other things, yet South Park's cultural importance made it difficult to walk away. This complicated relationship showed up in the work itself. Some later episodes felt like Parker and Stone commenting on their own experience of making South Park for too long. You're Getting Old, from season 15, could be read as Stan representing the creators feeling burned out and unable to enjoy anything anymore. The serialized seasons about current events overwhelming everyone could be read as Parker and Stone expressing their exhaustion with having to respond to news cycles constantly. What became clear was that South Park's evolution from seasons 1 through 25 was inseparable from Parker and Stone's personal growth from young men to middle-aged adults. The show changed because its creators changed. They had different interests, different perspectives, and different energy levels than they had at age 27. Expecting South Park to stay the same would have required Parker and Stone to stay the same, which was impossible. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding how the creators changed over time helps explain when and why the golden age of South Park quietly faded away without anyone agreeing on exactly when it happened. Section 11. When the golden age quietly faded. One of the strangest things about South Park's golden age is that nobody can agree on when it ended. There was no single episode or season that everyone points to as the moment the show stopped being great. There was no announcement from the creators that they were changing their approach. There was no dramatic drop in quality that made viewers suddenly realize something was wrong. Instead, the golden age faded gradually and quietly over several years, and different fans noticed it ending at different times depending on what they valued most about the show. Some fans believe the golden age ended with the movie in 2004. They argue that the movie represented the creative peak of everything South Park could be, and that everything after was diminishing returns. For these fans, the golden age lasted from 1997 to 2004, covering the first 7 seasons and the theatrical film. They point to how Season 8, immediately following the movie, felt different in tone and approach. Episodes like Up the Down Steroid and Douche and Turd seemed meaner and more cynical than what had come before. Other fans extend the golden age through Season 10 in 2006. They argue that Seasons 8, 9, and 10 still had the energy and creativity of earlier years, even if some elements were changing. They point to episodes like Make Love, Not Warcraft from Season 10 as proof that the show could still produce all-time classics. For these fans, Season 11 in 2007 is where things started to feel noticeably different. The episodes were still funny occasionally, yet something fundamental had shifted in what the show was trying to do. A third group of fans pushes the golden age even further, extending it through Season 14 in 2010. They argue that the show remained consistently excellent through the early 2000s, and that episodes like You Have Zero Friends and Coon vs. Coon and Friends demonstrated continued creativity. For these fans, the serialization experiments starting in Season 18 were the real turning point, where South Park stopped being what it had always been and became something else entirely. The lack of consensus about when the golden age ended reveals something important. Quality decline in long-running shows usually happens gradually rather than suddenly. There is rarely a clear line where a show goes from good to bad. Instead, there are shifts and changes that accumulate over time until eventually you realize the show feels different from what it used to be. South Park followed this pattern of gradual evolution rather than sudden decline. Looking back at the seasons most commonly identified as transitional, certain changes become visible. Season 8 in 2004 was the first full season after the movie, and it showed the creators experimenting with new approaches. The episodes were more topical and more focused on making arguments about current events. Goobacks, about immigration, and Douche and Turd, about voting, both felt like the show was becoming more interested in political commentary than in telling stories about the kids. Season 11 in 2007 marked another shift. This was when Randy started becoming more prominent in multiple episodes. More Crap devoted its entire plot to Randy trying to set a world record for the biggest bowel movement. Guitar Queero focused on Randy's jealousy of his son's video game success. These episodes were funny, yet they represented a move away from the kids being the center of the show. Randy was taking up space that used to belong to Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. Season 15 in 2011 included You're Getting Old, which some fans saw as a turning point. This episode dealt with Stan becoming unable to enjoy anything and seeing everything as literal excrement. The episode was surprisingly melancholic and seemed to be about depression and burnout. Many fans interpreted this as Parker and Stone expressing their own feelings about making the show for so long. The episode ended with Stan's parents separating, which was a huge change that later got reversed without explanation. Season 18 in 2014 introduced full serialization, which we have already discussed in detail. This was the most dramatic structural change the show had ever made. Many fans who had tolerated earlier changes found serialization to be a step too far. They felt that serialization fundamentally changed what South Park was in ways that could not be reconciled with what had made the show special. For these fans, Season 18 was definitively the end of the golden age. Yet, even within these commonly identified turning points, there were individual episodes that captured the magic of early South Park. Season 9 had Best Friends Forever, which won an Emmy.
Season 12 had About Last Night, which was timely and clever. Season 14 had Coon vs. Coon and Friends, which created an elaborate superhero mythology. Season 19 had Tweak X Craig, which told a sweet story about two characters in a relationship. These episodes proved that the show could still produce excellent work even during periods that are considered post-Golden Age. This inconsistency in quality made it harder to pinpoint exactly when the decline happened. If the show had suddenly started producing terrible episodes every week, it would have been obvious. Instead, the show produced a mixture of excellent episodes, decent episodes, and weak episodes in proportions that gradually shifted over time. The ratio of excellent to weak slowly changed until eventually there were more weak episodes than excellent ones in a typical season. The 6-day production schedule contributed to this inconsistency. Because Parker and Stone were creating episodes just days before they aired, there was little time for revision or quality control. Some episodes came together perfectly in that compressed time frame. Others felt rushed or half-developed because there simply was not enough time to refine them. This meant that even in later seasons, an occasional episode would recapture the brilliance of earlier years when everything aligned properly. The creators themselves seemed uncertain about what era of the show was best. In interviews, they would sometimes express nostalgia for earlier seasons when things were simpler. Other times, they would defend their newer work and argue that the show had improved over time. They rarely acknowledged directly that the show had declined, yet they would occasionally admit they were tired or that certain approaches had not worked as well as they hoped. Parker and Stone also made several attempts to recapture what had made early seasons special. After experimenting with serialization for a few seasons, they pulled back and returned to more episodic storytelling. They made efforts to focus more on the kids again after Randy had dominated for several years. They tried different comedic approaches when the topical satire became exhausting. These attempts suggested they were aware that something had been lost and they were trying to recover it. Yet these attempts never quite succeeded in bringing back the Golden Age feeling. Once changes had been made to the show's DNA, it was difficult to reverse them completely. The show could not simply go back to being what it was in 2001 because the creators were different people now, with different interests. They could try to recreate the style of early seasons, yet it would always feel like an imitation rather than the genuine article. The cultural context had also changed in ways that made it impossible to recreate the Golden Age. South Park in 1999 existed in a very different media landscape than South Park in 2015. In 1999, there were fewer television options and no social media. The show felt fresh and shocking because nothing else on television was doing what it did. By 2015, there were dozens of adult animated comedies, and everyone on Twitter was making satirical jokes about current events. South Park was no longer shocking or unique in the way it had been. The show's own success also made it harder to maintain Golden Age quality. When South Park was a scrappy cable show that could be canceled at any moment, the creators felt freedom to take risks and offend people. Once South Park became a valuable property that Viacom depended on financially, there was pressure to maintain consistent production and avoid controversies that might harm the brand. This pressure was mostly self-imposed, yet it affected creative decisions. The aging of the original audience also played a role in perceptions of when the Golden Age ended. People who were teenagers when South Park premiered in 1997 were in their 30s by 2015. The humor that had seemed hilarious and edgy when they were 16 might have seemed juvenile or tiresome when they were 35. Their own maturation affected how they responded to the show, making it difficult to separate genuine quality decline from their own changing tastes. Some fans dealt with the gradual decline by simply stopping watching. They would drift away from the show over time as it stopped resonating with them. They might still check in occasionally or watch episodes that got buzz online, yet they were no longer devoted weekly viewers. For these people, the Golden Age ended whenever they personally lost interest, which could be different for everyone. Other fans continued watching despite believing the show had declined. They remained loyal to South Park because of their investment in the characters and their history with the show. They might acknowledge that newer seasons were not as good as older seasons, yet they kept watching anyway, out of habit or hope that the show might return to form. For these fans, there was no clear end to the Golden Age, because they never fully gave up on the show. The streaming era complicated perceptions of when the Golden Age ended. When all seasons became available simultaneously on platforms like Hulu and Paramount+, new viewers could watch the entire series and form their own judgments about quality across different eras. Some of these viewers concluded that the quality was fairly consistent across all seasons. Others agreed with longtime fans that there was a clear decline. The availability of the full series allowed for more comprehensive evaluation. Looking at viewership numbers and critical reception provides some objective data about when the show's cultural peak occurred. Ratings for South Park were highest in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The show was a massive cultural phenomenon during its first several seasons, regularly appearing in news coverage and generating controversy. By the 2000s, ratings had stabilized at lower levels, and the show generated less mainstream attention even though it remained popular with its core audience. Critical reception also shifted over time. Early seasons received widespread praise from television critics who saw South Park as groundbreaking and important. Later seasons received more mixed reviews, with critics often noting that the show was still capable of brilliance, yet was inconsistent and sometimes felt tired. The show's reputation evolved from being a revolutionary force in comedy to being a reliable but unexceptional institution. The awards the show won also provide some indication of perceived quality over time. South Park won multiple Emmy Awards in its first decade, including Outstanding Animated Program in 2005, 2007, 2008, and 2009. After 2009, the show did not win that particular Emmy again until 2013. This gap suggested that even industry professionals felt the show's peak years had passed, though the show remained strong enough to occasionally produce award-winning work. What becomes clear when trying to identify when the Golden Age ended is that different elements of the show declined at different rates. The pure comedy and joke writing may have remained strong longer than the storytelling and character development. The willingness to take creative risks may have declined before the technical execution of animation and voice acting. The show was never uniformly excellent or uniformly weak. Different aspects waxed and waned over the years. The question of when the Golden Age ended also depends on what you think defined the Golden Age in the first place. If you believe the Golden Age was defined by cultural impact and mainstream relevance, it probably ended around 2006 or 2007, when the show stopped being a major topic of national conversation. If you believe the Golden Age was defined by consistent episode quality, it might have lasted until 2010 or 2011. If you believe the Golden Age was defined by a particular structural approach, it definitely ended with Serialization in 2014. Perhaps the most honest answer is that the Golden Age of South Park did not end at any single moment. Instead, it faded gradually over many years as the show evolved and changed in response to its creators aging, the culture shifting, and the demands of producing content for over 2 decades. Different fans noticed this fading at different times depending on their personal connection to the show and what they valued most about it. The Golden Age became something that existed more clearly in retrospect than it had felt while it was happening. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding that the Golden Age faded gradually rather than ending abruptly helps us think about what its end actually means for how we remember and evaluate South Park as a whole. Section 12. What the end of the Golden Age really means. After examining South Park's Golden Age from every angle, we need to step back and ask what it all means. What does it tell us about television, about comedy, about creativity, and about how we experience and remember entertainment that becomes part of our lives? The story of South Park's rise, peak, and gradual evolution offers lessons that extend far beyond one animated show about 4 kids in Colorado. The first thing the Golden Age teaches us is that creative peaks are temporary. No show can maintain its absolute best quality forever. The combination of factors that create greatness is fragile and difficult to sustain over time. South Park at its peak benefited from young creators with fresh perspectives, a cultural moment when its style of comedy felt revolutionary, and the freedom that comes from having nothing to lose. Once those factors changed, the show inevitably changed too. This does not mean that everything after the Golden Age was bad or worthless. South Park continued to produce excellent episodes and important cultural commentary for many years after its absolute peak had passed. The show in 2015 was still better than most comedy shows on television, even if it was not as consistently brilliant as South Park in 2001. Recognizing that the Golden Age ended does not require dismissing everything that came after as failures. The story of South Park also reveals how difficult it is to separate genuine quality from nostalgia and personal connection. Many fans who believe early South Park was superior are not wrong,
yet they are also remembering those episodes through the lens of who they were when they first watched them. The episodes meant something different when you were 14 years old discovering edgy comedy for the first time than they do when you were 35 years old and have seen countless other shows copy South Park's style. This nostalgic factor makes it almost impossible to create truly objective rankings of which South Park era was best. Someone who discovered the show in 2010 might genuinely prefer Season 15 to Season 5 because they watched Season 15 at the perfect time in their life for it to resonate. Someone else might find Season 15 disappointing because they watched it after already experiencing the high of early seasons. Both perspectives are valid, even though they contradict each other. The Golden Age also demonstrates the importance of creative constraints. Early South Park benefited from being a scrappy cable show that could be canceled at any moment. This uncertainty created urgency and freedom. The creators knew they might not get another chance, so they took risks and said everything they wanted to say without worrying about the future. Once the show became a secure institution that would obviously continue for years, that urgency disappeared and the creative approach became more conservative. Similarly, the episodic structure that seemed limiting was actually a creative gift. Having to tell complete stories in 22 minutes forced the writers to be tight and focused. Every joke had to matter. Every scene had to advance the story. When the show experimented with serialization and longer narratives, this discipline relaxed and episodes became looser and less carefully constructed. The constraint of the episodic format had pushed the show to be better. The role of the creators aging alongside their creation is another crucial lesson. Parker and Stone were inevitably going to change as people over 25 years. Their interests, their energy levels, their perspectives on life, all of these things evolved as they went from their 20s to their 50s. Expecting South Park to stay the same would have required them to stay the same, which was impossible. The show had to evolve because its creators evolved. This raises difficult questions about what we want from long-running shows. Do we want them to grow and change with their creators, even if that means losing what made them special originally? Or do we want them to stay frozen in time, repeating the same formulas until they become stale? There is no perfect answer. Both approaches have costs and benefits. South Park chose to evolve with its creators, which disappointed some fans, yet allowed the show to stay creatively alive for decades. The Golden Age of South Park also shows how cultural context shapes comedy. Jokes that landed perfectly in 2001 might fall flat in 2020 because the cultural moment has passed. References that everyone understood at the time become obscure. Controversies that seemed important feel trivial in retrospect. Comedy is perhaps the most time-sensitive art form because it depends so heavily on shared cultural understanding between the comedian and the audience. This time sensitivity is why early South Park episodes that were not built around specific current events have aged better than later episodes that were. Make Love Not Warcraft is still funny because it is about the universal experience of becoming obsessed with a video game. About Last Night is less funny now because it requires you to remember the specific feelings surrounding the 2008 election. The episodes that focused on timeless human experiences rather than temporary cultural moments had more staying power. The evolution of South Park also reveals how success can be a trap. The show became so successful and so valuable that it became difficult to end it or to make radical changes. Comedy Central and later Paramount Plus depended on South Park for revenue and prestige. Parker and Stone knew that millions of people worked on or profited from South Park's continued existence. This created pressure to keep the show going even when the creators might have been ready to move on to other projects. This pressure meant that South Park continued producing episodes long after it had said everything it needed to say. The show was no longer driven by the urgent need to express ideas that could not be expressed anywhere else. Instead, it was driven by contractual obligations and business considerations. This shift from artistic necessity to commercial obligation inevitably affected the creative quality and the sense of purpose. The divided fan base that formed around different eras of South Park reflects a broader truth about how we consume long-running media. We become attached to specific versions of things and resistant to change. When a show evolves in ways we do not like, we feel betrayed because the thing that brought us comfort and joy has been taken away. This feeling is understandable, yet also somewhat unfair to creators who are trying to grow and avoid stagnation. Learning to appreciate different eras of a show for what they are rather than comparing everything to the peak might be a healthier approach. Early South Park was brilliant for specific reasons. Later South Park was interesting for different reasons. They are not the same thing and should not be judged by the same standards.
Someone can prefer early seasons while still acknowledging that later seasons have value and accomplish different goals. The story of South Park's golden age also reminds us that television shows are created by real people who have finite energy and creativity. We sometimes expect shows to maintain excellence forever, without considering that the human beings making those shows cannot maintain that level of output indefinitely. Parker and Stone have been producing South Park for 25 years, while also working on other projects. The fact that the show declined from its peak is not a failure. It is simply the natural result of human limitations. What matters most is not that the golden age ended, but that it existed at all. South Park, at its peak, produced some of the most innovative and influential comedy ever made for television. Episodes like Scott Tenorman Must Die and Make Love, Not Warcraft will be studied and enjoyed for decades. The show changed what animated comedy could be and opened doors for countless other creators. That legacy is secure, regardless of how the show's quality evolved over time. The Golden Age also lives on through its influence on comedy and culture. The style of satire that South Park pioneered became the dominant approach for political comedy in the 2000s and 2010s. The show's willingness to offend everyone equally influenced how a generation thought about free speech in comedy. The specific phrases and references from Golden Age episodes became part of the language that people used to communicate. The impact extended far beyond the episodes themselves. For fans who grew up with South Park during its golden age, those episodes will always hold special meaning, regardless of what the show became later. The memories of watching with friends, quoting lines at school, and feeling like you were part of something transgressive and exciting cannot be taken away by later seasons. The Golden Age exists permanently in those memories and in the episodes themselves, which can be rewatched whenever someone wants to revisit that feeling. The end of the Golden Age also opened space for appreciation of South Park's longevity and adaptability. Not many comedy shows run for 25 years and remain culturally relevant for that entire time. The fact that South Park is still producing new episodes and still has a devoted audience a quarter century after it began is remarkable. Even if the show is not as good as it once was, the fact that it continues to exist and to try new things deserves recognition. Perhaps the most important lesson from South Park's Golden Age is that perfection is temporary, and that is okay. The show does not need to be perfect forever to be valuable. It does not need to match its peak quality in perpetuity to deserve appreciation. The Golden Age happened, it was special, and then it evolved into something else. That is not a tragedy. That is just how creative works develop over time when they are made by human beings who grow and change. Looking at South Park's full history with perspective, the Golden Age represents roughly the first third to half of the show's run, depending on how you measure it. That means a significant portion of South Park's existence has been post-Golden Age, yet the show has remained successful and influential throughout that period. This suggests that the Golden Age, while special, was not the only thing that mattered about South Park. The show's importance comes from its full arc over decades, not just from its peak years. In the end, what the end of the Golden Age really means is that South Park became a normal television show after being an exceptional one. It went from being revolutionary to being merely very good. It lost its status as the most important comedy on television and became one of many respected shows with devoted audiences. For fans who were there during the revolutionary period, this feels like a significant loss. For fans who discover the show later, it might not feel like a loss at all because they never experienced the revolutionary version. The Golden Age of South Park mattered because it showed what the show and its creators were capable of when everything aligned perfectly. It set a standard that the show could not maintain forever, yet tried to reach again in later years. It created a legacy that will outlast the show itself, and it gave millions of people comedy that made them think and laugh and feel connected to something larger than themselves. That is what television at its best can do, and South Park during its golden age did it as well as any show ever has. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.